Welcome back to the channel. Tonight, when we're alone in the dark, our imaginations can run wild, and the smallest sounds can become amplified into terrifying threats. But what happens when those sounds are more than just our imaginations? What if they're real? Tonight, we'll explore 5 stories of people who were home alone when the unthinkable happened. Each of these stories will send chills down your spine, and they're all the more terrifying because they're true. From mysterious noises to unexplained apparitions, these individuals faced the ultimate fear: being alone in the dark with the unknown. The fear of being alone at night is a primal fear that taps into our deepest anxieties. It's the fear of being vulnerable and powerless against forces beyond our control. And for the individuals in these stories, that fear became a harsh reality. If you enjoyed these bone-chilling stories, don't forget to hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. And remember to subscribe for more hair-raising content. 3 years ago I became a park ranger. I won't include the location of this event. I don't want anyone seeking out the utter horrors I've seen in that forest. You think that you're prepared for whatever the forest might throw at you. You hear about the strange occurrences from other rangers, the missing persons cases, the unusual animals that are like nothing you've ever seen before. I was arrogant. I just blew off these stories the other more experienced rangers told me as nothing but paranoia or attempts to scare the new guy. But I was wrong. I was so very wrong. I had to tell this event to someone. To warn people of the things that are out there hiding in those deep woods. Just waiting for that bold individual to walk right into their clutches. This is the reason I will never return to that forest and now live in a large city. I avoid the forest that I used to love so much because I'm terrified of what I'll find in them, or what will find me. 3 months into my time as a park ranger, it was the beginning of spring. For the past 2 weeks, we had been receiving strange reports from park visitors and a few fellow rangers. People had been seeing strange, warped-looking animals wandering about the park. The animals sighted often looked thin with patches of missing hair, had completely white eyes, were gaunt and almost skeletal, and the proportions of the animals were said to just seem wrong. As if the animals were just not completely convincing copies of the animals they were supposed to be. Of course, most of us just assumed there was some sort of disease starting to affect animals in the park. There was an older park ranger who'd started at the park a month before the sightings started, named Briggs, who warned us that he'd seen this before. He was worried, was insisting we should close up the park. He said that the animals were dangerous and a safety hazard to anyone inside the forest, but he wouldn't say any more than that. He just always looked haunted when he talked about those animals and said the forest wasn't safe anymore. Of course, we just wrote him off as being a kooky, paranoid older guy who'd probably had some kind of traumatic wild animal attack experience. We didn't even entertain the possibility that he might be right, and our hubris would be our downfall. I still remember something Briggs said to me one day shortly before he quit working at the park. It always was weird to me that Briggs was so disturbed by these animal reports and looked so haunted when he talked about them. He was a big man in his late 70s, but he could have easily wiped the floor with any youngster who tried to step up to him. He was an ex-Navy SEAL and a tough and real smart son of a gun. I was surprised he was so superstitious and paranoid that we should close up the park when it just seemed like some outbreak of a disease among some of the wildlife. All in all, it didn't seem like a big deal at the time. Briggs wouldn't say specifically why he was so insistent on closing up the park. All he would say to me on the subject was, "There are things in that forest you couldn't comprehend, boy. Things that'll break a grown man in two like a twig. They're smart, you know. We think we're the apex predator of this world, but we couldn't be more wrong. If you aren't afraid, you're a fool. They're coming out in droves and I don't know why. But I don't plan on being here to find out. I've seen the horrors of war, Sonny, and what I saw on the battlefield is nothing compared to what I've seen in that forest. Do the wise thing and listen to this old-timer before it's too late." I just wrote off what Briggs told me. but now I wish I hadn't. If I could, I would go back and change what I'd done, but it's too late now. And the horrors I saw will stick with me as long as I live. 1 week after Briggs warned us to close down the park, he quit and left the park behind. He was the smart one. He knew what was coming and didn't want to be around when all hell broke loose. I saw a glimpse of one of those strange animals on one of my patrols within that week, but it just looked like a sick raccoon to me. I thought nothing of it, and it was gone before I could attempt to catch it. But within 5 weeks of these sightings beginning, things had started to become stranger. We'd had 10 reports from park visitors of being attacked by these sickly-looking animals. All of them had told us the same thing. The animals seemed intelligent now, like they were hunting them. They seemed intelligent and they seemed angry. We were bewildered and unsure of what to make of the situation. We'd been trying to hunt down and put down the sick animals since the report started. We decided it was wiser to put down these animals to keep the sickness from spreading, but the animals remained elusive. The most any of us were able to do was catch occasional glimpses of them. But that all changed one night on the 6th week of the sightings. We'd also had 10 missing persons cases brought to our door within the past 2 weeks. Though we were unsure if this was attached to the sick animal sightings and were unable to find any traces of the missing people aside from some abandoned belongings and campsites. On a seemingly peaceful summer night, 3 of us were at the ranger station on the overnight shift. It was myself, Hank, a tough hulking man in his early 30s, and Lita, a petite girl in her late teens who was interning at the park over the summer. We had increased employee presence in the park due to the strange animal behavior of the past 2 or so months. It was close to 10 at night when we had a hysterical young blonde woman rushing into the station. She was covered in dirt and scratches, her clothing in tatters. She looked wild, like someone who'd been lost in the forest for weeks. She was sobbing, babbling, and collapsed into the arms of Hank. I started to check her for and treat her injuries as we tried to calm the woman down enough for her to speak clearly. After an hour, we managed to calm her down enough for her to be able to speak in somewhat coherent sentences. She was still hard to understand, but we managed to get the gist of what she had to say. The woman told us that she'd been camping in the park with her 4 friends. They'd set up camp in the morning and everything had seemed normal, but after the sunset things started to become strange. They started to hear odd noises coming from the forest and swore that they even heard talking. Though the voices sounded garbled and growled almost like someone who still wasn't completely sure how to form words. They'd started to feel on edge and had decided to leave first thing in the morning, but were too scared to venture out into the forest in the middle of the night with the strange noises they were hearing. She told us that after an hour of hearing the strange noises coming from the forest, a stumbling and almost hairless, sickly, gaunt coyote with pure white eyes came out of the forest and started venturing into the clearing where they had set up camp. The coyote was making strange noises like it was in pain, and the closer it got, the easier it was for them to see that the coyote seemed off. She said that the coyote seemed just a little too long and too tall to be a coyote, like it had been stretched or something. As the coyote got closer, her friend Trace got scared and decided to throw a rock at the coyote to scare it off. Instead of throwing the rock near the coyote, he threw a fist-sized rock at the coyote and hit it square in the head. The rock hit the coyote and it collapsed to the ground. After the rock hit the coyote, the forest seemed to go completely still, almost like time had stopped. The only sounds the 5 of them could hear were their own terrified breathing and the crackling of the campfire. They thought Trace had killed the coyote. In the eerie silence, they could see that it wasn't breathing. But then the coyote's body jerked. Strange cracking noises could be heard from the coyote's body as it twitched and contorted. Its body changed into an almost humanoid shape as it rose up on 2 legs. The coyote bared its teeth at the 5 of them in a sneer and then opened its mouth. They heard the coyote speak 2 chilling words in a deep guttural voice: "Feeding time." These 2 words seemed to send the forest into chaos as creatures of varying shapes and sizes swarmed from the tree line upon the 5 campers. Not all of the animals even seemed to look like animals or like anything the girl had ever seen before. The creatures dragged the 5 of them through the forest to a cave, dragging them inside into what seemed to be a dark and massive cave system. This is something I found strange considering that the only caves we had in this park were relatively small. There should have been nothing in that park like what this girl was describing. She told us that the animals dragged them into this cave system and trapped them in some kind of sticky, wispy substance that seemed almost like spider webs but with the strength of thick rope. She said she could barely remember what happened after that since she couldn't see at all in the pitch-black cave. All she could hear was the occasional screams of terror and pain from her friends and the squelching noises of what she knew was her friends being eaten. She wasn't sure how long she was in there. What she guessed was every few days one of them would be taken and fed upon by what she could only guess was the creatures that took them into the caves. The creatures also would force-feed her water and food every so often. Though it was clear from her gaunt and emaciated figure they only fed her enough to keep her alive. She said she was fed some kind of mush she was never able to identify. Only that it tasted utterly foul and almost like something rotten. When it was finally her turn to be eaten, she got lucky. She felt the threads that bound her being cut by what seemed to be some large claw or knife, and then she crashed to the cave floor. In a panic, she managed to grab a large rock. She struck out in the darkness towards where she believed to be the thing that had cut her loose. She could tell she made contact with something and heard a growl of pain as the creature hit the ground. She didn't wait to figure out how much damage she'd done. She'd just run. She ran for what felt like hours. She could hear the sounds of growls and what seemed like garbled speech she couldn't understand all around her, but somehow she managed to avoid the creatures who were hunting for her. She managed to escape the cave system and just ran blindly through the forest in the dark until she found the ranger station. After finishing the story, she just burst into sobs and begged us to protect her from the monsters that she thought were still chasing her. We realized, after hearing her story, that she was part of a group of 5 campers who'd gone missing in the forest 2 weeks earlier. It was a group of college students who'd come to the park on summer break, but after the first day of their camping trip their families and friends had stopped hearing from them. After 3 days of no contact from the students, we'd been notified that these campers were to be considered officially missing. We'd been contacted by the families even earlier than that and had run some preliminary searches, but, like the 5 other missing persons that had cropped up in the past 2 weeks, we'd only found an abandoned campsite and belongings from the campers. After some closer inspection of the girl and some coaxing for her name, we managed to identify her as one of the 2 missing girls, Abigail. At the time we believed that Abigail and her friends were likely drugged and attacked by some dangerous individuals in the forest. It was easier to think that Abigail had just crafted this unbelievable narrative as a way to comprehend what happened to her while she was kept heavily drugged and docile. After all, what sane and reasonable person could honestly believe the wild tale Abigail had spun? We left Abigail to eat and discussed amongst the 3 of us for a bit about what to do with her. We were quick to decide that the best course of action was to notify law enforcement that we'd found Abigail and that there were likely a group of dangerous individuals currently residing in the park. The 3 of us felt very disconcerted after hearing Abigail's story, but knew that we couldn't very well abandon our post in the early hours of our shift. At that point, we all just wanted to get Abigail somewhere safe and really wanted to leave the park, even though we couldn't. First I tried to call the police through the office phone, but the line was dead. That far out in the middle of nowhere phone service can be notoriously unreliable, so our mobiles couldn't be used to call the police either. The office phones were really our only way to contact the outside world unless we felt like wandering about until we managed to possibly get a bar of service. With the phone lines down, we just decided to shut down for the night and take Abigail to the police station ourselves. As we were gathering our things and shutting off the lights for the night, we all moved with a mutual sense of urgency. Human instinct is a powerful thing, and at that moment all of us seemed to sense that something was wrong. Suddenly Abigail started screaming loud enough that I was sure she could actually crack the windows. She started pointing towards the window straight across from the couch she sat on and screeching, "It's here! They're here! You have to help me! They're coming for me!" Initially, I thought that the girl was just hysterical. That was until I saw it. The thing was exactly like Abigail had described. It was a too-tall bipedal thing with gangly but muscled limbs and a patchy furred body. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, with the way its torso was the only part initially visible when I looked out the window. Then it crouched down and tapped a clawed hand on the glass. It had the head of a coyote with those milky white eyes. It grinned and let out a growl. "Come out," it purred in a gravelly sing-song voice. Abigail screamed and backpedaled away from the window, hiding behind and latching onto Hank while yelling that we needed to escape and begging us not to let them take her. I was frozen in fear. I was in no way equipped to handle this. I was just an average guy from Iowa with no special skills to speak of besides being decently athletic with an encyclopedic knowledge of the outdoors. The only thing I could do at that moment was stand frozen and staring in horror at the thing peering at us through the window and chuckling at our terrified faces. Surprisingly, what snapped me out of my shell-shocked state was Lita. She was the only one out of us who didn't look scared. Instead, she looked angry. She smacked me across the face hard enough to leave my ears ringing. Then she proceeded to do the same with Hank. Hank and I shared mirrored surprised expressions that Lita was so quick to action, and that her small form could hit that hard. "Get your shit together. You all need to get the hell out of here," Lita yelled at the three of us. She then proceeded to remove a black pistol from her pastel blue backpack. A multitude of questions were rushing through my mind. At the top of that list was wanting to know what the hell that thing outside was, and right below that was bewilderment at Lita's 180 shift from a bubbly, perky teenager to acting like some battle-hardened veteran. I didn't have much time to spend on these musings, however, as we heard the window crack. The coyote thing had placed a hard punch to the window that had caused it to fracture. One more good hit would surely shatter it. Then Lita raised her gun and fired. The bullet shattered the window and sent the coyote crashing back to the ground. "Hurry, get to Hank's truck, and get your fucking guns," Lita yelled. Hank and I already had our shotguns out and ready due to the reports of animal attacks. So we were able to snatch them up quickly as Lita took the lead to head for the front door. Abigail continued to stick close to Hank silently with wide, terrified eyes as we moved cautiously for the door. Lita threw open the door and I was shocked at what we were faced with. There were at least 30 of those warped animals we'd heard so much about. And at the head of them was the coyote with a now missing left arm and the shoulder stump looking like it had healed over years ago. The coyote was the only one to be in a bipedal form. The other animals looked warped in various shapes and sizes, some being recognizable animals and others simply looking like horrifying beasts I had never seen before. The only thing they all had in common was those white eyes. The coyote snarled and seemed to focus its attention on Lita. "You'll pay for that," it growled out. Lita sneered at the coyote in response. "Shove it, you overgrown flea bag," she shot back as she reached into her backpack and produced a flare which she was quick to light and hold out in front of her. The creatures recoiled at the light and the coyote let out a deep, unearthly growl. She hurled the flare into the crowd of animals and they scattered with unnatural speed back from the flare. "Go!" Lita yelled and the four of us made a break for it to the parking lot while we had the opening. Lita took the lead, taking a shot at any of the creatures who tried to leap at us as we ran. Her bullets seemed to have a strange effect on the creatures. The moment they hit, black liquid bubbled up from the injuries and the things would screech in pain as their bodies seemed to start to dissolve into that black liquid. Hank and I took a few shots at the things, but our bullets didn't seem to do much more than knock the creatures back briefly. When we did get to the truck, we all quickly piled in with Hank in the driver's seat and he gunned it towards the exit to the park right after the engine roared to life. I let out a breath of relief as I thought we were home free. Don't start relaxing. We're not out of the woods yet. Lita scolded me and then offered a hint of a smirk at the terrible joke she'd made. I looked at her in disbelief for a moment before an uneasy chuckle escaped from Hank and me, appreciating her attempt at calming the three of us at least. Lita's smirk quickly faded as she focused her attention on the blurred view of the forest outside the car as Hank sped along the road. "So, who the hell are you?" Hank asked as he kept his eyes focused on the road. But it was clear the question was meant for Lita. It was an unspoken question that had been hanging in the air ever since Lita jumped into action to deal with that coyote thing back in the ranger station. "I'll tell you what, Hank, I'll give you a nice lengthy explanation after we're out of the forest full of things itching to get at us." "Sound good?" she responded flatly. Hank gave a sigh in response. Fine, fair enough. Do you at least know what those things are?" he pressed. "Yes," Lita said shortly. Then she sighed heavily. "All you need to know is that they're really hard to kill and that if you want to bring them down you'd better aim for the vitals. They won't stop moving until their bodies are completely destroyed. Their eyes are sensitive to light and they'll naturally flee from it. Fire also does a nice job of doing heavy damage to them. You manage to engulf one in flames and they'll go up like a bonfire doused in gasoline. But get back quick before they explode unless you want to go smelling like roadkill that won't wear off for weeks. Exception to the flame rule is that coyote thing. Fire'll hurt it, but it's not enough to kill it. If something fucks up, you leave me to deal with the coyote while you all focus on escaping. The coyote gets taken out and the animals will stop attacking. There'll still be those things, but they won't be coordinated anymore. So it'll give you all the opening you need to get out," she explained. I stared at Lita with wide eyes, wondering how exactly it was she knew all this. I could tell Hank was wondering the same thing. But it was clear this was all Lita was willing to tell us at the moment. Abigail remained quiet in the back seat with me. She was just staring out the window with wide vacant eyes. Not that I could blame her after all she'd been through. I guess she just needed time to process everything. Before I could speak up and ask Abigail anything, I heard a loud metallic crunch and then we were airborne. I caught a flash of brown fur before the truck tumbled off the road, rolled down a steep hill, and came to a rest on its roof, having been stopped by a large pine tree. I sat suspended in the air by my seatbelt with my ears ringing and my body trying to process the shock of the crash. I was snapped out of my dazed state by Lita cursing loudly. "Shit. The truck is fucked," she huffed out as she unclicked her seatbelt and crashed to the roof of the car. "Is everybody okay?" she asked as she shifted to look at the rest of us. Lita had a deep cut on her right cheek and forearm with some various cuts and bruises scattered across her form as well, but she seemed mostly unharmed. "I'm okay, I think," I choked out before undoing my seatbelt as well and hitting the roof of the car with a pained grunt. Aside from some cuts and being sore as hell, I was fine as far as I could tell. Hank was similarly mostly unharmed aside from a thick bit of glass that had gotten stuck in his left bicep, but that was able to be quickly tended to by Lita by taking the glass out and tearing off a bit of his sleeve to tie around the wound. Abigail appeared to have passed out from the crash. She had a few deep gashes on her forearms and some smaller scratches, but otherwise she seemed unharmed. However, she was unconscious and it was difficult to assess how she really was until she woke up. Something odd I noticed about her that I wish I had paid more attention to was that her blood looked almost black. But I just assumed I was seeing things because of the poor lighting and already being very on edge. Hank and I gently removed Abigail from the wreckage of the truck while Lita surveyed the damage and tried to figure out exactly where we were. The truck was an absolute wreck. The passenger side had collapsed inward like something heavy had made impact with it, and the resulting roll down the hill and crash into the pine tree had completely totaled the truck. We were lucky the truck was as sturdy as it was, or we would have surely walked away with worse injuries than we had. "We'll have to continue on foot from here," Lita said before placing a hand over Abigail's mouth and giving her a hard smack to the cheek to see if she could wake her. Abigail woke with a start, but her resulting scream was muffled by Lita's hand over her mouth. Once Abigail took in her surroundings, Lita tore the sleeves off her own shirt and used the cloth to treat Abigail's wounds on her forearms. "Come on, we need to get moving before they catch up with us," she barked. The three of us followed behind Lita with Abigail in between the three of us, considering her unarmed and mostly unresponsive state. We all moved at a brisk walking pace, sticking to the shadows of the treeline, but never completely leaving the view of the road just in case a car happened to come by. For a while, we were able to continue on without interruption. The forest was almost completely quiet, not even a sound from an insect could be heard. The only sounds we could hear were the occasional howl or growl in the distance and the sounds of our footsteps and heavy breaths. Despite the terrors of the night, this was perhaps one of the most terrifying parts to me. That utter quiet and the sense that at any moment one of those things could rush from the forest to do who knows what. Then the silence was broken as a thing that resembled a large deformed porcupine the size of a wolf rushed at us from the underbrush. Lita fired off a bullet into the creature's chest before it could make contact, and it screeched and quickly started to dissolve as it writhed on the ground. Then the sounds of more growls and rushing footsteps could be heard as reinforcements rushed towards the area, attracted by the gunshot and the screeches of pain from the porcupine-like creature. "Run!" Lita yelled before breaking off into a sprint. The three of us quickly followed, with Abigail pulling ahead of Hank and myself despite her frail condition. She had enough sense to at least not run out ahead of Lita, but her swift movements were startling. At the time I chalked it up to adrenaline. We ran with the sounds of those creatures pursuing us filling the forest around us. Lita, Hank, and I fired off the occasional shot when one of the things tried to jump at us from the forest, but we managed to keep ahead of the creatures. Or that's what we thought anyway. As we emerged out into a large clearing, the moonlight illuminated the coyote, who seemed to be even larger than the last time we'd seen it, though its left arm was still missing. Behind it stood a large half-circle of those creatures of numbers of at least 50 who all stood waiting, hissing and snarling as if they desired nothing but to charge and tear us apart. Lita didn't hesitate to raise her gun and take a shot at the coyote, but when she did, all that sounded was an empty click. She was out of bullets. "Shit," she said softly under her breath, quickly reaching to the side pocket of her backpack as if reaching for more ammo. Before she could reach the side pocket, a squirrel-like thing the size of a large dog came crashing down from the tree above and smacked into her back. Lita cursed as she struggled against the creature, but it held firm. Hank raised his shotgun to try and shoot the squirrel creature off of Lita, but as he made that move he was knocked to the ground by the small, frail form of Abigail. She had landed a hard elbow to his ribs that caused a loud crunch. Hank groaned in pain as he instinctively curled into himself, and Abigail took that opportunity to pin him to the ground on his stomach, with a too-wide grin settling on her features that showed sharp teeth. Her eyes were white now, like all those other fucking things. As she held him, her body started twisting and crunching as her limbs grew longer and distorted, with her skin taking on a papery white shade with a gray tinge. She bit into the side of Hank's neck, and he let out a pained gurgled sound as she took a chunk out of the side of his neck. "Damn it, Hank," Lita yelled as she struggled still against her captor. Then she looked at me with an intense gaze. "Get out of here," she roared with a tinge of desperation in her voice. In that moment my survival instincts took over and I listened. It was as if my body went on autopilot while my mind raced. I thought that I couldn't just leave Lita and Hank behind. I had to stay and try to save them. But even as I thought this, I kept running, like my body had a will of its own separate from my mind. I tore through the forest, everything fading into a blur as I just focused on what was ahead of me. I don't know how long I ran for, but eventually I felt something heavy crash into me. I hit the ground roughly and felt the wind get knocked out of me. I briefly saw the shadowed outline of a hulking figure before I fell unconscious from the hard impact. I did have to split this into two parts because what I wrote was too long to put into one. I couldn't bear to cut away anything. This is all important. You all need to know what happened. When I woke up, everything was still dark. I wondered if I was even still alive. All I knew was that it was dark and I couldn't move. Then I heard a groan from nearby. Ah shit. I heard Lita's voice say softly before I heard a slight rustling like someone was struggling. Lita? I croaked out in question and I heard a gasp from nearby. Thank fucking goodness you're still alive, she breathed. Then she let out a more frustrated sound. But that means they caught you. I have a plan to get us out of here, but you need to do exactly what I say if you want to survive this, she said in a hushed tone. What about Hank? I whispered back and Lita was quiet for a long moment before she spoke up again. Hank's beyond saving now. You don't want to know. Trust me, she said with a pained whisper. Now stop talking. You don't want them knowing you're awake. And whatever you do, don't let them feed you anything, she said with a renewally steeled tone. I did as I was told and shut up after that. I don't know how long we stayed in that darkness. I could feel myself suspended in the air and completely unable to move. It felt like I was wrapped up in some kind of cocoon made of a sticky substance similar to that of a spider's web. It was exactly the same conditions that Abigail had described in her story. The only sounds I heard all that time were an occasional shuffling, which I assumed to be Lita, and the distant sound of footsteps and soft growls. After what could have been hours or even days of just staying silent in that oppressive darkness, I heard a ripping noise, and then a loud thunk and a grunt. I wanted to speak, but remembered Lita's words and forced myself to remain quiet. I just waited and hoped that that was the sound of Lita escaping. I heard footsteps approaching me and held my breath while attempting to press myself back against the stone wall behind me on a deep-rooted instinct to cringe away from the unknown thing that approached. Then I heard a ripping noise shortly before my bindings gave way and I went crashing unceremoniously to the rock floor below. While I lay there with the wind knocked out of me, Lita ripped the sticky bindings away from me and I quickly scrambled to my feet. You're going to have to trust me. Stay close to me and I'll get you out of here, Lita whispered in my ear. I nodded before realizing she couldn't see me in the pitch darkness and instead whispered back, okay. It was all I could think to say at that moment. I heard a strange crunching noise and then Lita grabbed my hand and started to swiftly lead me along as if she was able to see where she was going. I noticed that her nails felt sharper than before as she held tight to my hand. I felt fear bubble up as I wondered if she was becoming something like what Abigail had turned into. But I forced myself to bury that fear. Right then, Lita was my only chance of making it out of that place. I had to trust her. I didn't have any other option. We moved through the darkness for what seemed like forever. We seemed to be moving through some sort of massive tunnel or cave network like the one from Abigail's story. We would mostly move with hurried steps, but on various occasions Lita would stop me and pull me into little crevices or side tunnels when the sounds of footsteps neared us. Then after the footsteps faded, we would continue on our way again. I began to wonder if we would just be wandering this cave network until we finally just collapsed. I could already feel the hunger, dehydration, and exhaustion gnawing at me. But I kept pace with Lita, forcing myself to keep walking even when it felt like my legs were turning to stone. Then I finally saw a beautiful sight. There was light streaming into the stony area about 15 feet ahead of us after we turned a corner. As we drew closer to the light, I could see that it was moonlight streaming into a large hole of some sort that looked to have been dug by massive claws. The hole was roughly 5 feet above us and led into some kind of tunnel to the surface. I felt my heart sink as I realized there was no way we could reach the hole to escape through it. We would have to continue on back into the darkness. I'll boost you up to the edge of the hole. Do you think you can pull yourself out? Lita spoke up as I let myself fall into a crestfallen state. I looked at Lita's petite 5-foot form in bewilderment. I felt my eyes widen as I was finally able to take in her appearance. Lita's form had changed. She had grown more muscled and she looked practically feral. Her short black hair was wild and she was covered in dirt, but she looked uninjured despite her dirty appearance and very torn blood-stained clothing. Her nails had turned to claws and when she spoke I could see her teeth had changed to sharpened points. When I finally met her eyes, they were no longer that piercing hazel green they had been. Now her pupils had changed to slits and her eyes were a glowing gold shade. I instinctively took a few steps back from her as I took in her inhuman features and she firmly grabbed my wrist. "Now isn't the time. I told you. If you want to make it out of this, you're going to have to trust me," she said firmly. I slowly nodded and she released me in return. Then she laced her fingers together and placed her palms upward to allow me to step on them so she could lift me to the hole. I complied and she lifted me with surprising ease. I dug my fingers into the dirt and scrabbled my way up through the hole and out into the forest above. I collapsed onto the ground on my back, taking in deep lungfuls of air for a moment and let out a short laugh of relief to be away from that horrid darkness. Then I remembered Lita. I looked down through the hole that appeared to be an animal burrow hidden beneath a large thick bush from the outside. Lita looked up at me with glowing golden orbs before she jumped upwards and dug her clawed hands into the dirt. I grabbed her hands and helped pull her out of the hole, though I'm not entirely sure she needed my help at all. Once we were both out in the forest, Lita held a hand up when she saw me about to speak. "No questions. Not until we're out of here. Don't talk. Just follow and do what I say. That's how you're going to make it to see the sunrise," she said in a voice that left no room for argument. I just nodded in response to show her I understood. She nodded back and then we were off. The forest was still as strangely quiet as it was when we were captured, and I wondered if it was even the same night anymore. I had no idea how many days had passed since we had taken down into the cave network. We could have been down in that cave system for days for all I knew. We just walked in silence as the moon moved across the sky. I didn't ask where we were going. All I knew to do at that point was follow Lita and hope that she had a plan. Lita seemed to tense some as we walked, but she said nothing beyond making a circular upward motion with her hand that I took to mean as, "Be on your guard. You're quite the clever little girl. Such a shame that you chose the wrong side of this war." A deep rumbling voice spoke that seemed to echo around us. Lita let out a soft growl in response. "Yeah, if you're so upset about it, then why not come and handle me yourself? Unless you're too scared to face me directly. You seem chicken shit with the way you're having all your lackeys do the fighting for you," she barked back, which earned cold laughter from the voice, which I assumed to belong to the coyote since it was the only one of the creatures I had heard actually speak up to that point. Then a dark shape seemed to emerge from a nearby oak tree that quickly shifted and took the form of that coyote I was beginning to grow familiar with seeing. It was grinning at us with its head cocked to the side ever so slightly as if it were amused. "As you wish," he said before he rushed at us with alarming speed. Lita was backhanded hard enough that she went flying through a number of trees which crashed to the ground as Lita skidded to a stop on all fours roughly 30 feet away. The deep gouges in her forearms she'd gotten from the coyote's claws were already healing as she charged at the coyote. The coyote let out a roar that was mixed with laughter as Lita charged at it as if it were relishing the challenge that had been presented to it. The ensuing fight was one I only caught glimpses of as I attempted to distance myself from the two. I saw glimpses of Lita savagely tearing into the coyote and drawing inky black blood from the thing with each hit. She was superhumanly strong with the way she was able to send the coyote flying. It had grown to be at least twice her size by that point, with a far more muscled figure than its previously gaunt form. The fight between the two seemed as if it would never end as they destroyed the forest around them. Every time the two dealt injuries to the other, they would heal almost as fast as they were given. Trees felled around the two, and slowly their battle zone was changed more into a clearing filled with jagged stumps and fallen trees. Despite Lita's strength, she still seemed out of her league against the coyote. As fast as she was able to heal, the coyote still dealt more damage than Lita and seemed to land attacks on her far more often than she did to it. And yet she never seemed to tire or give up. She just looked at the coyote with this deep-seated rage as she stubbornly continued to battle it. I stayed hidden behind a large rock on a small cliff near their battlefield. I should have run, but I just couldn't as I watched in horror, and yet almost wonder, as the two superhuman entities clashed. I just silently hoped their fight would not come near to me, as I knew I would only get in the way or get hurt in this battle between two things who were far beyond the strength of a normal person like me. I could already see Lita was facing a challenge against the coyote with it only having one arm, and I wondered just how dangerous would this thing be without that handicap. Then I quickly pushed that thought away as I felt panic overtaking me at that idea. Whatever the hell this thing was, it was a monster of overwhelming strength that I could still barely fathom the existence of. Finally, the coyote got the upper hand, if you could even really call the hulking, patchy-furred thing a coyote anymore. It managed to pin Lita to the ground with its massive clawed hand holding her down by her throat and upper chest. Lita choked and gagged as she clawed and kicked at the coyote's arm, and it just laughed at her struggling even with her claws tearing chunks from its arm. I felt panic build up in my chest at the sight. I felt as if I had to do something to help Lita, but I had no idea what I could do. If Lita wasn't able to stop that thing, there was no way I stood a chance. But I decided that I couldn't leave Lita to just perish at the hands of this thing. I'd already lost Hank. I couldn't just stand by and lose her too. I picked up a heavy rock from the ground nearby and attempted to stealthily approach the coyote while its attention was focused on Lita. "You make such delicious prey, little girl. Such a shame that you didn't last longer. It has been so long since I've been provided such a challenge. My compliments. Even your mother wasn't quite so strong as you. But alas, you'll suffer the same fate as she did." The coyote hummed with glee while Lita glared up at it with seething hatred in her expression. "I'll kill you," she snarled back in a choked, gasping voice as she more viciously attempted to struggle loose from the grip of the thing. "Ah, still so spirited. I'm sure that fire in you will only make you an even more delectable morsel," the coyote chuckled, simply seeming amused by Lita's fury. The coyote opened its jaws wide as its face split into 4 even pieces and opened like horrific flower petals to reveal a large black maw lined with white needle-sharp teeth, and out from its throat flickered a deep red tongue reminiscent of a massive octopus tentacle lined with suckers that had silver spikes at the centers. I rushed forwards to hurl the rock right at the head of the creature and hopefully distract it long enough to let Lita get loose. The thing closed in as if aiming to bite into Lita with its monstrous mouth. I felt a sinking in my chest. I was too late. Even with Lita's astounding healing abilities, there was no way she could survive her head being bitten off. But then the thing's chest exploded in black gore as a loud bang sounded throughout the forest. Its body was soon torn apart by more explosions as more loud bangs filled the forest. Lita bolted to her feet as the creature's body started to dissolve into that black liquid I had seen the other things dissolve into. Its head flopped to the ground and changed back to the more coyote-like shape. Somehow it spoke, even with its head now being the only solid piece of it left. "This isn't over," it hissed out. "You haven't seen the last of me. We will have our victory." It gasped. Then its head exploded in another burst of gore, and all that was left of the beast was puddles of black goo that quickly dried and floated up into the air in little black flecks as the sky started to change with the first shades of dawn. I felt the rock drop from my hands as a familiar voice spoke from the edge of the tree-line. "You sure make quite a mess here, huh?" I turned and couldn't believe my eyes. There Briggs stood with a shotgun in hand and a proud grin present on his face. Lita gave Briggs a withering look in response. "Took you long enough, Grandpa. Those damn reinforcements you promised were almost too late. We lost some good people while you jackasses sat around with your thumbs up your asses," she scolded the older man. I felt my mind begin to swim as I tried to process all the events that had transpired over the course of the terrifying affair. As I tried to take in the scene in front of me of the heated back and forth between Lita and Briggs, all their voices sounded like to me were faraway echoes. Blackness started to form at the edges of my vision, and then I fell unconscious. When I woke up, I was in a hospital in the nearest city to the state park. I was told I'd been transported to the hospital from a clinic in the nearby town to the state park. According to the hospital staff, I had been brought in with deep gashes, dehydrated, and emaciated. I'd apparently woken up and spoken deliriously of monstrous animals attacking. So it was assumed I'd been attacked by either a bear or wildcat, based on my injuries, and had become lost in the forest for days before eventually being discovered by two hikers. At first, I attempted to argue and recount what really happened, but I quickly figured out that the hospital staff just assumed I was still delirious. They weren't going to believe me. I did discover that it had been a week and a half since the night that those things first attacked. After I was discharged from the hospital, I immediately quit my job at the state park. My supervisors didn't ask any questions. I saw that a missing persons report had been filed for Hank, but no law enforcement ever questioned me about what happened at the state park. In fact, there was never any reports at all of what happened in the park that night. And after that night, the strange animal sightings in the park just fizzled off soon after. I thought about going to the police and telling them my story about what happened, but I knew that they would just ignore what I said. After all, who would believe such a strange story? I hadn't believed Abigail at first. Surely no one would believe me either. Since then, I've moved across the country to a large city in an arid climate full of flatlands and desert. I want to be far away from any forest. I know that the media and law enforcement won't believe my story, but I recently heard about this subreddit from my girlfriend. She's the only one I've told this story to since then. She's the only one who believes me. She encouraged that I post this here. I think she hopes it will be therapeutic for me. But I decided to post this story because I want to warn anyone who will listen. Watch out for the forest. There are things out in those deep woods far beyond human comprehension. Whatever I saw in that forest, I have no doubt there's more out there. I remember what it said to Lita. It mentioned a war. It said it would come back. The people that go missing out in the forests, the strange things that happen, maybe there really isn't a logical explanation for all of it. So if you start to see animals that look wrong with those white eyes in a forest, get out while you still have the chance, or they might just come for you next. I hope that my tale will serve as a warning to all of you who choose to listen to it. I haven't seen Lita or Briggs since that night, and I can only hope they're doing well wherever they are. While I still wonder what those things are that attacked that night, I'm too scared to really go looking for the answers I want. As far as I'm concerned, I hope I never have to step into another forest again. But another part of me has started to become less scared over the years. I feel angry for all the horrors those things brought on. They killed innocent and good people like those college kids and Hank. I want to know what they are, and I want to stop them. There's a state park a few hundred miles from me, and I've seen increasing reports of animal attacks and missing persons there lately. Maybe I should go there and warn them before things go too far. I sat on the story I wrote for a week. I wasn't sure whether to post it or not after giving it more thought. Yesterday, I got a visit from someone I never thought I'd see again. I heard a knock on my apartment door, and before me stood Lita. She didn't look like she'd aged a day since the last time I saw her. She looked like how she had when I first met her. Tanned caramel skin, piercing hazel green eyes, a petite figure, 5 foot nothing, and jet black hair. The only difference was that her hair had grown down to her waist and was tied back in a messy braid. She looked up at me with that intense expression of hers before offering me an amused smile. "We need to talk," she said simply. Of course I let her in. She just waltzed into my apartment like she owned the place and took a seat on my couch. "Nice place you've got. A little plain. But you were always kind of a basic guy, huh?" she said casually as she surveyed my apartment while I stared at her in disbelief. Then she motioned for me to take a seat in the armchair across from her. In dumbfounded silence, I just did what she said. She's surprisingly good at getting others to follow her commands. That small figure just seems to exude authority when she wants it to. "Well, I did promise you I'd explain everything. And I'm finally here to uphold that promise. After I explain, I've got a favor to ask," she said. I just stared at her in response for a long moment before finally just sputtering a stuttered, "Okay." Lita laughed. "Always so good with words, huh, Jack?" she teased. "That's my name, by the way." Lita continued on to first tell me that her name isn't actually Lita. Navina is her name. So Lita, now Navina, continued on to explain just what happened in the forest that night, and just who she really is. According to Navina, she comes from a long line of monster hunters. What we encountered in the forest 5 years ago was a parasitic species that can take over organic creatures that are controlled by one hive mind, which, in this case, had taken the form of that coyote. They come from another world and showed up on Earth about 200 years ago. They're a species that tries to colonize worlds and consume whatever they get in contact with. But Navina's group has been able to keep them at bay. They've taken to calling the species webbers since they trapped their victims in that spider web-like substance, and the parasite looks somewhat like a spider when removed from the host. And yes, Navina and I agreed the name wasn't the best, but it's what stuck. The Weber is a much larger creature that separates itself into smaller creatures which will then take over a host. They believe there are multiple Webers from whatever world it is they come from, but they don't know how many. They also don't actually know how the Webers get here. Thus far there are 5 Webers who have attempted to invade Earth, and only one of them has made repeat attempts. There have been 15 invasion attempts in the last 200 years. Whether that means they killed the other Webers when they stopped them, they don't know. They just know this one particular Weber they've taken to calling BW for Big Asshole Weber is the one who keeps coming back. Navina says that her people need to start coming up with better names. The Webers will take one primary host body on Earth and then extend their control outwards into other creatures by trapping them and feeding them its black blood so that the body becomes suitable for habitation. Then they will eventually turn into the warped creatures I saw 5 years ago. I angrily asked Navina why she didn't warn Hank and me about Abigail then, and she just sadly stated that she couldn't alert the Weber that she was onto its game. She thought maybe there was still time to save Abigail since there have been cases where people in the process of becoming hosts have been able to be saved. She regretted what happened to Hank and that she couldn't save him. She explained that night was a train wreck and that she was supposed to have reinforcements come much earlier, but due to extenuating circumstances they hadn't been able to arrive on time. Navina explained that her mother had been killed by the same Weber she fought that night. Then she proceeded to nonchalantly drop that she was able to fight BW so efficiently because she's not human. No, in fact she's a half-demon. She had to use a spell that suppressed her demonic abilities while she worked at the state park so BW wouldn't detect her, and the effects of the spell had finally worn off when we were trapped in the cave system. She only laughed at my dumbstruck expression, shrugged, and said that her mom had weird and kind of shitty taste since her dad had never really been around anyway. She'd been raised mostly by her grandpa, who was in fact Briggs. Surprise, surprise, that's not his real name either. So the man, who was really named Brigian, left weeks earlier to get enough reinforcements to come back and deal with BW when the signs had started showing up that another invasion was coming. But, as you all already know, he didn't get back until everything had already gone to shit. If I ever see him again, he and I have some things to talk about. Navina explained to me that not only are there Webbers, demons, and magic. Apparently there's a good many things that are real, like vampires, werewolves, angels, fae, and dragons, among many other things. I'll really need to ask her more about that later. She sped over that whole point as she explained that her organization were people who kept the peace and stopped the bad guys who threatened the balance, as she calls it. Can't say their name, unfortunately. Top secret and all that. She tells me that her group in the organization is looking for new members. They need reinforcements since it's looking like that state park I've noticed may be the site of a new invasion. Well, I'll cut to the chase. I said yes. I've got an opportunity to do something against those bastards and do some good. So I'm going to take it. Navina's standing behind me now while I write this. She's very amused by how I describe her. She's also told me to stop treating her like a kid since she's over 100 years old. That leaves me with a lot more questions I need to ask her later. But I've got a lot I'm still trying to process. So one step at a time there. Agreeing to join this organization means that I'm leaving everything behind now. I don't like the idea of leaving my girlfriend behind, but I know she wouldn't understand all of this or why I feel I need to help Navina and her people. After I finish writing this, I'll be packing my things and making what preparations I need before I set out with Navina. My parting words to all of you are to be vigilant. There are many strange things in this world that we write off as nothing but fantasy. But what many of us forget is that there are many things we don't know about this world. Better to keep a watchful eye than be caught off guard if you do encounter something hidden from the majority of the world. With that, I thank you all for reading my story, and I hope that you heed its warnings. What happened in that park to the people like Hank and Abigail was a tragedy. Hopefully I can do something to now save people like them. Best regards, and signing off, Jack. Perhaps I'll be making another report here one day to warn you all of more of those strange things that exist in this world so often unseen by the masses. I started working for Glenrock State Park 3 months ago. It was supposed to be an easy job. It's not some dangerous mountainous terrain filled with cougars and wolves, but a relatively flat expanse of deciduous forest. That's why I was surprised when, only a few days into the job, I got pulled out on a search and rescue mission. Again, this wasn't some dangerous terrain where lots of hikers went missing. I often saw young families with toddlers walking the mile trail to the waterfall. People would go for light jogs, have picnics and barbecues, bring their little ones to play in the stream. The surrounding towns were safe, the terrain was easy. The biggest threat we had was black bears, which, don't get me wrong, can be very dangerous, but still a far cry from cougars and cliffs and serial killers on the loose. Anyway, the missing person was a young woman about 20 years old. Her name was Heather Ricks, and she had taken the red trail with her dog, a 3-mile loop into the forest. Again, like all the trails, it was an easy hike. It shouldn't have caused any problems for her, assuming she had no underlying health conditions. But she didn't come home. Her boyfriend had called the police, worried sick about her. He'd quickly ruled out all the other possibilities. She wasn't the type to up and leave. They'd had plans the next day. He hadn't heard from her by phone. No credit card activity. She'd disappeared without a trace. We began the search. 2 other park rangers came with me. Donnie, a young guy still working towards his degree, and Miranda, an older woman who'd been working here for years. We started off on the red trail together, scanning the woods for any sign of Heather. I knew we were in for a bad time when we found her dog. He was roaming around about a 1/4 of a mile off the trail, panting and exhausted. Donnie took him back to the ranger station to get him food and water. We searched the surrounding forest, kicking up leaves and scanning the bare trees, but there was no other sign of Heather. Miranda swore under her breath. Damn it. Not another one. Another one? Do people go missing here often? We've had some bear attacks. 3 in the last year. On that morbid note, we continued deeper into the woods. Around the halfway point, Miranda and I split up. She headed south while I headed north. "You got a compass, Mark?" she asked when we started off. "No. I have my phone. Reception cuts out sometimes." She dug in her bag and pulled out a compass. "I got a spare. Take this one." I took it to be polite, but I didn't plan on using it. The park was only about a mile or two wide. Unless I found myself deep in a cave somewhere, I'd have reception at every point inside the park. We continued in our opposite directions. Eventually I came to a stream. I followed it as I continued north, watching the black water roll over the rocks. The soft gurgling, splashing sound calmed me. It sounded just like those white noise machines that's supposed to help you fall asleep. I pulled my phone out just to check that I was going in the right direction. And that's where things started getting weird. When I opened Google Maps, the map didn't show a stream next to me. Generally speaking, the map schematic, whenever I'd used it, would show a little blue line where rivers and streams were, even if they were relatively small. I switched over to satellite view. Same thing, there was no cut or break in the sea of trees to show that a stream was there. It was just pure forest stretching out in every direction. I guess the trees are tall enough to hide it. I walked over to the stream. The black water lapped over the rocks, glistening in the light filtering through the waves above. My own reflection stared back at me, distorted by the rippling water. I dipped my fingers in. The water felt slightly warmer than it should be, not by much, but here in November I'd expect it to feel ice cold. Instead it was only cool. I shook my head and stood up. Then I continued further into the forest. "Heather," I called out, scanning the trees. "Heather, can you hear me?" No reply. Just the birds chittering, the wind rustling the leaves. I lost sight of the stream as I continued north. And then, about 20 minutes later, I did find something of Heather's. My heart stopped when I saw it. A purple knitted hat, lying on the forest floor. It was one of the items she'd been last seen with, according to her boyfriend. I had a whole list of things to look out for, things that might belong to her. I took a photo and texted Miranda and Donnie. When they didn't reply right away, I decided to head further into the forest. Maybe she's still alive. Maybe she needs my help. I continued forward, scanning the forest floor for her white puffer jacket, her pink sneakers. Anything that stood out against the mass of brown before me. And about 10 minutes later, I did see another flash of color. I ran towards it, heart pounding, and found her jacket on the ground. Except, there was something wrong with it. Her jacket was laid out perfectly on the ground. It wasn't bunched up or twisted or tangled, like you'd expect it to be if she'd gotten into a fight with an attacker. It was laid neatly across the leaves without even a wrinkle. And it was zipped up. The cogs in my brain turned as I stared at it. That means someone zipped it up after it came off her. Unless she took it off on purpose? Zipped it up and lay it there to pick it up later? But that didn't make a lick of sense. It had been between 30 and 40 degrees all week, even at the warmest parts of the day. Nobody would voluntarily take off their jacket and leave it in the forest, which only meant one thing. Someone had left it here, on the ground, deliberately, for us to find. I lifted my gaze and scanned the trees, my heart pounding. The forest was silent now, too silent. I didn't hear the calls of birds or the rustling of leaves. It was just pure silence ringing in my ears. And then, ding ding ding. I jumped about a foot in the air as my phone made a texting sound. Hands shaking, I pulled it out of my pocket. To see a text from Miranda. "Go back to the ranger station immediately." As I glanced at the photo of the hat I'd sent her, I noticed it too had been laying perfectly across the ground. I quickly snapped a photo of the jacket and sent it over. I found her jacket, but it looks like it's been staged? 3 dots appeared, indicating Miranda was typing a reply. Then, Get out of there now. Snap. The sound of a stick breaking. I glanced up and saw movement among the trees. I couldn't see anything between the crisscrossing trunks and overhanging leaves, just a flash of shadow, a flash of movement. I broke into a sprint. A few minutes later, I pulled out my phone to make sure I was going the right way. It took me longer than I would have liked, but finally I made it back to the trail. Even though my lungs were burning and my legs were aching, I forced myself to sprint back down the trail. I didn't let myself stop until I was at the ranger station/visitor center at the front of the park, panting wildly. Then I slipped inside and collapsed into a chair. Miranda was on the phone with someone. She eyed me as I came in, and then continued to the unknown caller. Yes. Vacate immediately. Tell them it was another bear attack and it isn't safe. Pause. Let me know when you're done. She hung the phone back up on the receiver and turned towards me. We're vacating the park. Can you set this up at the trailhead? She threw me a roll of yellow caution tape, then handed me a red sign that read closed. Okay. Donnie should be here any minute. When you see him, tell him to help you clear out the parking lot. Davis and Jackie are clearing out the trails, so they don't need any help there. I had a million questions, but I did as I was told. Donnie came back just as I was hanging up the sign, and the two of us cleared the parking lot. Less than an hour later, the park was empty, the gate was closed, and the five of us were holed up in the ranger station. Jackie, Davis, and Miranda seemed to know something we didn't. They talked in hushed tones in the back room with the door locked, which left Donnie and me sitting in the main room with nothing to do. She doesn't want us to leave, I said, tapping away at a stupid mobile game on my phone. Which is dumb because we're not doing anything here. Still getting paid though, Donnie replied. Isn't that a good thing? Yeah, I guess. An awkward silence settled between us. Donnie was about 10 years younger than me, I think, and I wasn't sure what I had in common with some Gen Z teenager. I racked my brain for something to talk about, but came up empty. She didn't tell you what was going on? I asked again. He shook his head. There's no way it's bears. I think it's some serial killer on the loose, he said. But they don't put that on the news because they don't want people to panic. I mean, laying down her clothes all nicely like that, luring you out somewhere, that's serial killer behavior for sure. Very helpful, Donnie, I thought sarcastically. But I kept my comments to myself. I stood up and walked over to the window. It was starting to get dark outside. The sky had turned an intense shade of deep blue in the throes of dusk. All the crepuscular animals had begun to stir. Birds flitting back to their homes, deer moving about. I reached up to close the curtains. Something caught my eye. No. The caution tape I had so carefully strung across the trailhead had been torn in two. The closed sign lay on the ground. I squinted, my heart beginning to pound. It had been fine 20 minutes ago, after we cleared the parking lot. Maybe it was just a deer. Maybe a deer tripped over it and ripped it with its hooves. But as I stood there, staring out into the darkness, I saw something else. A shape just at the tree on the other side of the parking lot. It didn't move. I squinted, but in the darkness, it could have been anything. An oddly shaped tree trunk, a fence post, a bush. Still, the way my eyes immediately snapped to it, I wondered if it wasn't there before. If it was someone standing there. I squinted. The door creaked open behind me. I turned around to see Miranda, Jackie, and Davis walking into the main room. Donnie stood up and began asking them about the bear attacks. I turned back to the window. My blood ran cold. The shape was no longer there. Those black bears are a lot more vicious than you think, Miranda was explaining to Donnie. Never get between a mother bear and her cubs. She'll tear you right to pieces. I had an uncle out in Fort Wayne. I closed the curtains, the metal rings screeching against the curtain rod. Then I turned back to the four of them, my heart pounding in my chest. I'm gonna head to the bathroom, Donnie interrupted, slipping past them. Be right back. You still pay us for bathroom time, right? Like the clock's still running? Miranda rolled her eyes. Yes, Donnie. He disappeared into the back of the building, which gave me the perfect time to confront them. Miranda glanced at me, then continued towards the door. Jackie and Davis followed her. Without so much as a goodbye, she reached for the doorknob. Wait, you can't go out there. I saw something in the woods. The three of them exchanged looks. Miranda took her hand off the doorknob and turned towards me. What did you see? There was someone standing there, just at the tree line. And the caution tape is down, ripped in two. Ich lernte hier. Are you going to tell me a bear did that? Or are you going to tell us what's really going on? She glanced between Jackie and Davis. Okay, fine. She sat down across from me and heaved a sigh. We think there's some sort of murderer on the loose. What? It only started happening a few months ago. This town, this park, they were always so safe. The worst incident we had in 5 years was somebody had their dog off their leash and it bit someone. We had nothing, no weirdos, no bear attacks, nothing. But then, 3 months ago, Emily Johnson went missing. She disappeared after she went for a jog on the Red Trail. It was all over the news, especially because she was a pretty blonde 20-something. Missing white woman syndrome and all that. People had all kinds of theories. That she was nabbed by some stalker or serial killer or whatever. We had volunteer search parties combing the woods, park rangers combing the forest, all of that. We even had people leaving flowers and teddy bears along the Red Trail, where she disappeared. And that's when the next incident happened. Miranda hesitated, glancing at Jackie then at Davis. One of these people, holding a vigil or whatever, disappeared. It was an older woman who'd known Emily as a student or something. She was just gone. No trace of her. We redoubled our search efforts, but we didn't find anything about her either. In the past 3 months, a total of 5 people have gone missing. All women. All from the Red Trail, never from any other trail. She grimaced. Then, one morning while out on patrol about a week after the second woman disappeared, Jackie found Emily's sneakers. And it was like your pictures of the hat and jacket. The shoes were placed next to each other, and the shoelaces were tied in neat little bows. It was obviously staged, purposely placed there for someone to find. That's horrible, I said. I can't even imagine. Well, it gets worse, Miranda replied, crossing her arms. A week later, we found Emily's necklace. In the ranger station. We changed all the locks, of course, and we had the police out here several times. They didn't find anything. A chill ran down my spine. I glanced back towards the window, but it was now too dark to see across the parking lot. I stood up and pulled the old curtains over the window, then returned to my seat. Clearly this whole thing is a game to him, Jackie said. He enjoys seeing us afraid. I mean, if he had access to the ranger station at one point, he could have easily snuck up behind one of us and killed us. But that's not what he wanted. He wanted to scare us, watch us squirm, play with us like a cat plays with a mouse it's going to eat. But the police are looking for him, right? Do they have any leads? I asked. The police? Miranda shook her head. Well, they're useless, basically. I mean, they're investigating, they've ruled out some guys, but they haven't actually nailed down anyone. No suspects. At least, none that they've told us about. They keep telling us they're going to find him, but they never do. That's because it isn't a him, David interrupted. Miranda rolled her eyes. Oh, come on, not this again. There are a few things we've seen with the case that don't make sense with what a human would do. A few weeks ago, I saw this silhouette several hundred yards through the trees. I started chasing it, but it moved too fast. Even Usain Bolt couldn't run that fast. Davis. And there's also the howling. We hear it only at night, around midnight. It sounds like this horrible blend between a woman screaming and a dog howling. That's a northern screech owl, you idiot, Miranda snapped at him. And it disrupts the electromagnetic field. If it's anywhere in range, your cell phone will cut out. That's why I make sure to always have a compass on me and not rely on GPS. Wait, I glanced from Miranda to Davis. You gave me a compass. I don't believe him, she said, shaking her head. I just think a compass is more reliable than a phone. But she sounded slightly uncertain when she said it. Like she didn't believe him, but also wasn't ruling out the possibility that there was some cryptid running wild in the woods. Look. Davis stood up and approached me, pulling out his phone. He flicked his fingers over the screen and then handed it to me. Look at that photo, he said. You can't tell me there's something seriously fucked up going on here. I looked down at the screen. It was a grainy photo of the forest, zoomed in as far as the camera could go. Between two birch trees, there was the sliver of a dark shape. It was incredibly tall, maybe about 8 or 9 feet. The problem was because the resolution was so terrible, and it was mostly obscured by the trees, you really couldn't tell what it was. It could be anything from a tree trunk to some random debris to a weird compression artifact. Cool photo, I told him. I heard the howling noise at the same time, he replied, echoing through the forest. I thought you only heard the howling at night, Miranda snapped at him. Usually at night. Jackie's heard it in the day. Jackie shrank away, looking ashamed. Well, I did see something out there, I told Davis. It wasn't super tall though. It looked like a person moving through the brush, wearing a light-colored shirt. That's the whole point, Davis replied. We're dealing with a skinwalker. This is its true form in the photo. It can change shape to imitate people. So what you saw was probably the skinwalker in the shape of someone else. Okay. Now I could see why Miranda was so dismissive of Davis. He didn't think there was just something unexplainable in the woods. He thought it was specifically a shape-shifting skinwalker whose mere presence disrupted the electromagnetic fields around us, hiding out in this tiny state park in the middle of nowhere. I wouldn't be surprised if the next words out of his mouth were something like, I saw him getting donuts at the Latham Bagel Shop. We sat there in awkward silence. I tried to think of something that wouldn't totally offend Davis, but also not egg him on. The last thing I needed was for everyone at this job to think I was some cryptid-believing kook like he was. Can you go get Donnie? Miranda asked, turning towards me. It's been like 20 minutes. I guess so, I said, getting up. But as soon as I stepped out of the front room, I heard Miranda, Jackie, and Davis talking in hushed whispers. I lingered just outside the doorway for a moment and caught snatches of their conversation. Can't tell him that. Do you really think? I strained my ears. Hurry up, Mark. Reluctantly, I walked down the hallway, up the stairs to the small attic level where the single bedroom and bathroom lay. Donnie? No answer. I walked right up to the bathroom door. Donnie, are you just playing on your phone? Silence. An uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. I raised my fist and knocked on the door. It creaked open under my fist. My heart plummeted when I saw the lights were out. Donnie? I called, my voice shaking. You here? My fingers fumbled along the wall, looking for the light switch. Click. I froze. Donnie lay on the floor. His shirt was drenched in blood, spilling out onto the tiles, seeping into the crevices. His eyes were closed. I don't remember screaming, but I must have, because soon Miranda, Jackie, and Davis were stomping up the stairs. They ran in behind me. The world turned into a blur of color and noise as they rushed to help him. But I just stood there, frozen, my legs shaking underneath me, because on the counter was Heather's purple hat, neatly folded next to the sink. My name is Peter Tully, and my story is not a happy one. I protect a land that is brimming with horrors beyond your dizziest nightmares. The truth of this region is a secret safeguarded by a few burdened souls. It is our duty to shield the world from the twisted terrors within this place. I have seen things that eyes cannot discern, and I have learned things that minds cannot fathom. After 20 years of this unending hell, I am ready to share my story. It is by no means a short tale. And this is only the very beginning. When I moved to Scotland in the spring of 2004, I was a young man. I left the Metropolitan Police Force behind, and I accepted a position as a park ranger in the Scottish Highlands. Maria and I were hoping to start a family. It was a clean slate. "Are you sure this is what you want?" Maria asked. "Of course," I said. "Are you?" "Well, it's a bit late for both of us to be asking these questions now," Maria laughed, motioning at the window. "We're already in Scotland." I smiled. "I know, but you can always say the word. We could hop in that car and drive back to London." "I don't care about London," she said, wrapping her arms around my neck. "I care about you." I kissed her forehead. "This won't be like the city, Maria. It's peaceful out here." "Every job comes with challenges, Peter," she said. "Are you ready to jump straight into work? You can take more time to recover." "I love you," I said, tightly squeezing my wife. "But I'm ready for this." We were so naive. The Highlands is a region of Scotland known around the world, and yet it is not truly known by anyone. At least, not this particular piece of haunted woodland, a location that I will not disclose. The Highlands is a vast, sprawling region, and I pray nobody finds my park. You would be wise to never try. When I arrived at the village's local pub on my induction day, I was met with steely glares from the establishment's handful of early morning drinkers. It was the sort of standoffish demeanor that newcomers often receive from locals, especially an Englishman in a Scottish village. Ancient prejudices never really die, do they? "Over here, Peter," a man hoarsely bellowed. I turned to see Matthew Wright, the old man I recognized from my job interview. It had only been a month since our online call, and yet the fellow had somehow aged 10 years or so. He must have been in his late 60s at the time, and I could only assume it to be stress-induced aging. The result, most likely, of Matthew fulfilling park duties, given the previous ranger's disappearance 3 months prior. That was the real reason for Maria's concern regarding the new job. The murky circumstances surrounding the opening of the position in the first place. "Hello, Matthew," I said, sitting opposite the weathered man. "How are you?" I'm well," he replied in a soft, gruff voice. "Are you and the wife settled?" I nodded. "Yes, this village is idyllic," Matthew coarsely interrupted. "Quaint, tranquil, beautiful." I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, unsure as to how I should respond to the sudden curt remark. "There is truth to that," the old man said. "But this haven is the tip of safety atop the iceberg. Beneath the surface, things look quite different." "I'm not sure I understand," I awkwardly replied. "I wouldn't expect you to understand," Matthew said, pausing for a moment. "You impressed me in your interview, Peter. There was a reason that I asked so many questions about your time on the force. I wasn't looking for an ordinary person. I was looking for somebody who had already stared horror in the eyes." I stifled the gulp that involuntarily rose to the top of my throat. "Are you okay?" Matthew asked, possibly noticing that the color had drained from my face. I nodded, composing myself. "Yes, I'm fine. Well, I'm thinking about the woman who held the position before me." "Shirley Pond," Matthew said. "I understand your hesitation, Peter. Who would want to fill the position of a missing person? Well, I won't lie to you. These woods are dangerous. The job comes with risks." "I know," I said. "You warned me." I hadn't divulged that piece of information to Maria, as I knew she was already uneasy about me returning to work after the nervous breakdown in London. "I did," Matthew said, sighing. "But, well, what do you imagine might have happened to Shirley? What's the worst thing you've imagined?" I frowned at the horrid nature of the question. I imagined that she'd either tumbled over a mountainous cliff edge or met her demise at the hands of an animal. Still, there are very few wild animals in the Highlands. A boar could have attacked the park ranger, but it was highly unlikely. "Here's the thing, Peter," Matthew said, seeing that I had no answer. "Your darkest fantasy does not compare to the true nature of the forest. And though I want so desperately to tell you what you will find in the woods, I will not bother." "Why?" I asked, frowning. Matthew sighed. "You wouldn't believe me, boy. You simply would not believe me." "Try," I said. "No," he replied, shaking his head. "You would laugh in my face and leave." He said a lot without saying much, and I started to piece things together in my brain. The man no doubt believed in cryptids, monsters, the boogeyman, perhaps old Ness herself hiding in the loch. Being an English city boy with a rational approach to life, I didn't believe in such things. "What's out there? Some sort of creature?" I asked. Matthew eyed me for a few seconds, perhaps searching for the faintest hint of a smile on my face, any sign of mockery, and I was certain I'd be fired before I even started. "There are those who know what lie in those woods," Matthew said, nodding his head at a couple of the drinkers in the pub. "They've seen things. Seeing is the only way to make a person truly believe." "Well, why didn't you hire a local?" I asked. "Look at us, Peter. We're old. Too old. And I couldn't bring myself to ask our children. But a stranger? Well, that seemed—" Matthew suddenly paused, contemplatively scratching his face. I think I've rushed into this. Perhaps you." "You said it yourself," I interrupted, feeling the job opportunity slipping from my grip. "Nobody else is in a fit state for the position. It has to be me." Matthew suddenly slammed his fist onto the table, and the entire pub fell silent. Nobody moved a muscle. Nobody made a sound. I waited for the man to find his calm, collected disposition again. "Peter," he eventually said, "you don't even know what's in those woods." "No," I agreed, "but I know I have to redeem. I just have to do this, Matthew. And as you said, I won't believe until I see it for myself." "And even then you won't believe," Matthew whispered. I smiled victoriously. "So, does that mean I have the job?" "Only if you accept one thing," he said. "Go on," I replied. Matthew sighed. "Once you take this path, you cannot leave it." I nodded in acceptance. I'm not sure whether the man viewed me as courageous or moronic. A mixture of the two, I imagine. Whatever the case, Matthew stopped resisting. He begrudgingly drove me from the village to the watchtower, a wooden structure that loomed over the mountainous region which would become my domain. "The Highlands of the Dead," Matthew said as we clambered out of the car. "That's an ominous name," I responded. Matthew sighed. "Dreadful things have happened here. We've had our fair share of tragedies over the decades." "The schoolteacher?" I said, vaguely remembering a certain news story. "Yes," Matthew said. "What he did was unthinkable." I nodded, strolling towards the staircase at the foot of the watchtower. "You've stopped prying me for information about the woods," the man noted. I shrugged. "I know you won't tell me. What's the use?" I just know that you would run," he said. "Not from fear. Most likely you would view this job as a farce. You would think me to be some sort of crackpot." "I already think that," I thought, stifling a laugh. Matthew gave a rundown of the duties that I would be expected to perform. He was searching for things to say, drawing out the initiation period, possibly hoping that I would change my mind. Eventually the man sighed heavily. "Right, well, I suppose I'd better go," Matthew said. I nodded. It's going to be fine. Okay, he replied uncertainly. There were no parting words of wisdom from the old man, a man who, perhaps, was not really that old, more hardened by the things he'd experienced, as I would soon learn. During the first few hours of my shift, I admired gorgeous vistas from my sheltered room atop the watchtower. Stunning, jagged terrain stretched to the horizon. Lakes glistened in the late afternoon sun. Luscious green pastures and rocky hillsides lay beyond my serene pine tree forest. It was a place of outstanding beauty. Highlands of the Dead felt like a cruel name to me. It was around 8 in the evening that the sun began to set, and in the soft orange glow of the day's diminishing light, I saw something peculiar. About a mile in the distance, the forest appeared to be moving. After hurriedly lifting my binoculars to my eyes, I saw that trees had been felled, and a building had inexplicably appeared in the clearing. What the... I started, immediately grabbing my things and sprinting out of the door. By the time I'd reached the bottom of the watchtower staircase, the light of the day was almost entirely gone. I turned on my torch and began to navigate through the towering trees which had seemed so minute and manageable from the height of the watchtower. On the ground, however, I felt small and fragile. This only worsened as night came and a heavy blanket of darkness engulfed me. Come on, I told myself. Stop it. You're becoming a local already, believing in ghosts and demons. I blamed the tragedy of the schoolteacher for the superstitious nature of the townsfolk. Trauma can do awful things to a person's psyche, and the man in question had done things beyond awful to the village. I'd read about it in the paper several years prior. Arnold Haversham took 3 children into the woods, committed unspeakable acts, and then hanged himself from a tree. Nothing supernatural there. Untoward, but unfortunately very human in nature. That was what I repeated to myself as I walked farther into the woods, farther from the warmth and comfort of the watchtower. But when I reached the clearing, I could no longer rationalize anything. A building had emerged from the underworld. It had torn through grass and dirt, splintering the surrounding trees. No felling or man-made construction. This building, sprouting from nothingness, had created itself. And when I realized that I recognized the structure, I stumbled backwards in horror. It was the village school. A moss-covered, ghoulish representation of the building was lurking in the depths of the Scottish Highlands at the dead of night. How? I whispered, shaking. Matthew had been right. The horrors of the woods had to be seen to be believed. But I hadn't even seen the true horrors yet. A scream pierced the night, and I tumbled to the ground, managing to hold onto my torch. The haunting, pained sound came from the belly of the demonic building, a building that had clearly just risen from hell itself. And yet, defying all sensibility, I found myself clambering to my feet and walking towards the ajar front doors. Redemption. It had been served on a platter. A chance to right my wrongs. A chance to forget London. I tore the splintered doors open, almost pulling one of them from its hinges. Then, stepping over the bumpy ground that had risen through the cracks of the tiled floor, I shone my torch into the great abyss before me. I was lighting an overgrown, long-forgotten corridor. The apocalyptic hallway was lined with rusty lockers coated in vines. The tiles crumbled beneath my feet, giving way to dirt and rocks. And as I disappeared deeper into the paranormal building, I began to regret my decision. But just like Matthew and the other villagers, trauma was guiding me blindly forwards. Help! A distorted voice screeched from the darkness. I followed the sound down a corridor to the right, finding that my torch seemed to be struggling to permeate the thick shadows of the halls. The school's atmosphere was slanted, disjointed. There was a blackness beyond comprehension within those walls, and there was a silence which gave way to the sound of my heartbeat. "Please," the girl cried. It came from a room at the end of the corridor, classroom 11A. Steadying my torch in my trembling hand, I took tentative steps towards the doorway, finally hearing something. A scratching sound in an otherwise silent building. Free hand pressed against the door, I gently pushed it open. It revealed a tiny box room with 3 chairs and a whiteboard on the far wall. But there was nobody inside. There was only the ever-loudening sound of scratching from above. "Hello," I called. The scratching stopped, and all that remained yet again was the sound of my heartbeat, an ever-quickening rhythm. Without warning, the ceiling tiles gave way. I yelled in terror as 3 bodies came tumbling down. I fell through the open doorway and looked up at the terrifying scene from the ground. 3 school children, 2 boys and a girl, swayed from nooses which led into a blackened void beyond the vanished ceiling. But these were no corpses. The children had hollow eye sockets burrowing deeply into their faces. Their gaping mouths revealed black chasms to match their eyes, and their skin was shallow, it scarcely clung to their skeletons, much as their tattered uniforms barely clung to their bodies. But most horribly, their necks were elongated to a couple of feet in length. With every swing, their terribly long bodies lightly brushed the tiles of the floor. "Help!" My eyes shot to the dead girl, whose empty, lifeless mouth twitched to utter that ghastly plea. Body frozen, I hoisted myself up and turned on my heel. I could hear moans of agony from behind me as I sprinted along lightless corridors, struggling to navigate my way out of the school. Everything looked different. I was caught in an ever-changing maze. And when I finally found the school's main entryway, the ground began to quake. The ceiling above slowly descended, and as dirt filled the school entrance, I realized the spectral building was sinking. I sprinted towards the exit, desperately trying to maintain my footing on the rocky surface beneath my feet. I could feel the fresh air spilling through the doorway. My brain was waking from a trance. Why did I even come in here? I wondered. The haunted place had clearly wormed its way into my brain, but I was almost free of it. And then, as I crawled through the half-sunken doorway, something clutched my ankle. "You belong," a sinister voice shrieked. I turned to face a hand rising from a crevice in the dirt. A near fleshless, ghoulish limb slithered upwards, and when its face emerged, the blood drained from my own. Like those of the children, it was rotten, bearing shallow eye sockets and a blackened mouth. A mouth that opened wide, unleashing a deep, unyielding cry. And as I looked upon the unliving thing, my mind filled the blanks. I remembered the picture from the news article. Arnold Haversham. The building was plummeting into the ground below, and the abomination from a hellish dimension was trying to take me into the hollow. I dug my fingernails into the dirt, desperately scrambling to stay in the world above. And then I saw something. Illuminating the blackened hole, I could faintly distinguish another pair of rotting hands. Slender but just as hauntingly unearthly. The brittle fingers coiled around the schoolteacher's inhuman face, and the man growled ferociously as an unseen creature separated him from me. As my ankle finally slipped out of Haversham's grasp, I jumped to my feet, watching the ground seal above the haunted school and its inhabitants. The forest suddenly seemed so peaceful, but it had lost all of its beauty. It only had taken one night for me to understand the disgruntled man. Not stopping to catch my breath, I ran back to the watchtower, and then I sat in my office, shivering, until Matthew arrived around 5 in the morning. He saw my pale face and smiled pitifully. "I tried to warn you," he said. "How is it real?" I whispered. "What did you see?" He asked quietly. "The schoolteacher," I replied. Matthew Wright raised an inquisitive eyebrow and widened his eyes. "Haversham?" "Yes," I said. "Isn't that what you saw?" He shook his head. "Peter, there are many things in this forest, and none of them—" "I quit," I interrupted. "But you knew that already." "Wait," Matthew said sternly. "What did I tell you?" "I don't care," I said, heading to the door. The old man tightly grabbed my arm as I passed him in the doorway. You will, he said. Once you take this path, you cannot leave it. Just watch me, I replied. If you try to leave the highlands, Matthew continued, refusing to release my arm, you join the undead. What are you talking about? I asked. Matthew leaned closer and whispered, you belong to the woods now. We all do. I stared into the old man's eyes and saw for a second the same hollow cavities that had eyed me from Arnold Haversham's face. And then I remembered the haunting entity's words. You belong. You're lying, I said. Then why haven't we left? Matthew asked. Knowing what we know, do you think we would choose to stay here? You're crazy, I replied, wrenching my arm free. That's why. Matthew followed me down the staircase as I hurried away from him. Think of Maria, he said. What does this have to do with her? I barked, stopping and turning to face the man. Everyone in this village is entwined with the highlands, he explained, placing a hand on my shoulder. I tried to warn you, Peter. No, you didn't, I said, snarling as I squared up to the old man. You lured me to this cursed village. You tricked me into agreeing to do this job. Your warnings were meaningless. You knew I would view you as nothing more than a crazy old man telling stories. You knew exactly what you were doing. Matthew replied. Maybe, but I had to do it for the village. We need a ranger and I'm falling apart at the seams. Do it for the village? I cried, laughing manically. What use am I against horrors of that magnitude? Matthew gripped both of my shoulders tightly and spoke coldly. The woods need souls. That is our purpose. We sacrifice our souls to it every night. We give it a piece of ourselves. And in return it spares the village. It spares everyone. I paused. The man's weary and worn face finally made sense. Everyone except us, I whispered. Matthew nodded. Everyone except us. So I kill myself slowly like you? I asked. That's my lot in life? You save the village, he said. That's your lot in life. I wish I could offer a happy ending. But 20 years later, at the age of 42, I find myself becoming the now-deceased Matthew Wright. I have assumed his role as a withered, worn-out man. A man who, on a nightly basis, sacrifices himself to the highlands of the dead. And why? To protect Maria. To protect our son Henry. To protect everyone. I strive to free myself of this prison. Though there are things I have learned over the past 2 decades, the full truth of these woods is still a mystery to me. My wife and I moved to Scotland in 2004. Our home sits in a cursed village at the edge of a forest, and I was enticed to this place by a job prospect that ultimately sealed our doom. I'm a former police officer, but it wasn't until I entered this forest that I experienced true fear. I've seen things over the past 20 years that would ice your flesh. Undead corpses live in the dense heart of the woods. On my first night shift, I encountered them in a haunted school, and I scarcely escaped with my life. Matthew Wright was the aged man who offered me the role. He warned me that horrors hid in the forest, but he failed to divulge that it would be my prison. If any villager attempts to leave this place, they join the legions of undead terrors within the forest. And that is why I sacrifice myself to the woods on a nightly basis. It is my lot in life. The highlands of the dead is a sick land. It demands minds. And park rangers bear that burden. In turn, this paranormal place spares the village. I wish that were the end of my tale, but life has not dealt fair cards. In 2006, after 2 years on the job, Henry was born. I can't believe we have a Scottish baby, my wife joked. I'm not sure that's how it works, Maria, I replied, smiling. We're still English. You're living in denial, she said. The wee lad will be down at the pub with you and Matthew before long, downing pints and talking about that one time he saw an adder snake in the forest. I don't know. I've no idea what you two discuss. I grunted, changing the subject. But my wife wouldn't let it lie. Why do you hate talking about life as a park ranger? She asked. It's just, Matthew. He's my boss. It's hard to see him as a friend, I said. I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth. How would I have approached the topic? Matthew lured us here under false pretenses. The forest is cursed. We're cursed. And now our baby is cursed. She wouldn't have believed me anyway. Oh, great. I'm sounding just like the old man now, I thought. I tried to focus on the tiny beacon of light that we had brought home with us. Life had given us something pure. I had a wife and a son. Not everything about my existence was terrible. Still, you wouldn't be here if I had a pleasant story for you. It was late November 2006. Henry was 10 months old, and I was so consumed by the duties of parenthood that I hardly had the mental fortitude to endure the forest's nightly torture. I spent most nights sleeping in the sheltered room at the top of the watchtower. My heart felt lighter in truth. The woods can't hurt me anymore, I told myself. But the pathways in my sleep-deprived brain clearly weren't connecting. I should have realized that I wasn't allowing the forest to feed on my soul, and that meant it was hungry. Peter, Maria screamed. Her shattering cry of agony woke me from my pre-work nap. Drenched in sweat, I rubbed my eyes and glanced at the alarm clock. 9:30 p.m. An hour before my shift began. Maria? I sleepily groaned. Henry's gone. She shrieked in a voice barely human. Every tendon in my body tensed. I leapt up, donned my ranger gear, and rushed into the baby's room. The window had been shattered, and Henry's empty cot rocked eerily in the wind. I heard this smash. Oh, Peter. He was already gone when I came upstairs. Maria sobbed before screaming again. Who would take him? Who would do this? I don't know, Maria, I said, embracing my wife. But we'll bring him home. I will find him. I ran out of the house, beelining for my car. I noticed black clouds blending with the night sky. A storm approached. My neighbor, Tommy, was standing in his front garden. With elbows pointing outwards, he clasped his hips with his hands. He was sucking his teeth and disapprovingly shaking his head. Careful on your shift tonight, Peter, he warned me. Weather's taking up. Tommy, I need you and Maggie to watch Maria for me, I said, unlocking my car. The man frowned. What the devil is the matter with you, lad? I pointed animatedly at the non-existent second-floor window, and when Tommy looked up at it, his eyes widened. What's happened there? He asked. I don't know, I said, opening the car door. But I don't care about that, Tommy. Henry's gone. I didn't stop to say anything else. Something in my gut told me that I had to drive. Henry was in the forest. I could feel it. I sped through the deserted streets of our village, heading onto the curved road which led into the highlands of the dead. And as I drove, I became aware of a growing rumbling from the sky above, a guttural groan. And then a blinding bolt of lightning illuminated the forest ahead. It was followed by a menacing thunderclap and a torrential downpour of rain. When I eventually reached the watchtower, the storm had reached a feverish crescendo of light and sound. The wooden structure was swaying uncertainly under the strain of the wind's endless onslaught. And as another lightning bolt struck the forest, it illuminated the sheltered room at the top of the watchtower. That was then I noticed something truly dreadful. The silhouette of a tall creature with spindly arms and legs. It almost had the shape of a woman, and in its arms, it cradled a bundle. Henry. The lightning disappeared, and the room plunged back into darkness. I flew out of my car and trudged through the thick, slushy muck leading up to the watchtower staircase. Lighting the way with my torch, I took the steps two at a time, repeatedly losing my footing on the drenched metalwork. A sudden smashing noise startled me, and I braced myself against the handrail. I'm surprised I heard it over the roar of rain and thunder, but paternal instincts are unimaginably powerful, and the hair on my skin was standing upright. I leant over the side of the railing, looking up to the top of the watchtower, and then I screamed in horror as I saw two shriveled, discolored arms shakily stretching over the edge of the top floor's railing. Fingers of an abnormal length were curled around a familiar star-covered blanket. There was absolutely no doubt in mind. Henry was inside. No, I screamed. I was still 20 feet from the top of the tower. I wasn't going to make it in time. The fingers released and the bundle plummeted. I felt the world slow around me. As I curled my back over the edge of the railing, I watched the blanket unravel above me, and little Henry, with limbs flailing, tumbled out of it. His terrified eyes were swimming with tears, and he screeched manically as he fell towards me. His body clunkily connected with my chest, and I frantically scrambled to scoop him up. Against all odds, I caught him. I lost my footing for a second, but I managed to brace my body against the railing, and then I pulled the two of us to safety. Heart racing, I fled down the staircase, and I was perplexed to find another park ranger vehicle parked alongside mine. It was Matthew. "What are you doing here?" I screamed over the rain. "Maria called me," Matthew shouted. "Is Henry okay?" "Leave us alone," I growled, barging past the man. "You've been sleeping up there on your shifts," Matthew continued, "not venturing into the forest, not feeding it." "Have you been watching me?" I asked. "I have a village to protect, Peter," the man said. "Then you take over." I yelled. "I have a baby. I don't sleep. And you didn't say I couldn't spend my shift in the watchtower." "You haven't been giving the forest what it needs, Peter," Matthew said. "So, it found another way to get what it wanted." "You need to take Henry home," I said, ignoring the man's chastising comments. I took Henry's car seat from my vehicle and belted him into Matthew's car. Then I turned to face the top of the watchtower. I hadn't seen the looming, slender creature emerge. Is it still up there? I wondered, bracing for the sight of a dark shape on the staircase. But nothing came. "I'm an old man. I don't have much fuel left in the tank, boy," the man coughed. "You don't want me to take the reins. I'd doom us all to oblivion." "What did I see up there?" I asked, ignoring him. A tall woman snatched him and... "Woman?" Matthew asked, eyes wide and lip trembling. "Yes," I said. "Well, something that looked like one." Matthew eyed the watchtower before running around to the driver's door of his car. He took one last look at me and uttered a parting warning. "Stay in the woods tonight," he cried hoarsely. "Do not retreat to the watchtower." I watched the man speedily drive away and I sighed heavily. I cared only that Henry was being taken to safety. But as I stood in the heavy downpour, drenched to the bone, I wondered whether I might perish from hypothermia rather than whatever nightmare lurked in the woods. I had given the forest what it wanted. Not fear, it demanded attention. My baby's life had almost been snatched from me. What more could the Highlands want? Surely, I had paid for my crime of neglecting the wretched place over the months? I wish Matthew had told me what would come next. The storm ceased. Not slowly. Not naturally. All sound abruptly halted, as did the rain and lightning. The clouds rapidly vanished, giving way to a patch of moonlight on the small clearing in which I found myself. A rumble began beneath my feet, the sound of earth shifting. And then a hand sprouted from the soil before me, the same hand I had seen earlier in the evening. Spidery fingers shot outwards at a terrifying speed. Before I had a moment to react, the ghoulish palm had planted itself on my face. I sank into blackness. I wasn't in the forest anymore. I was in the world of that woman, that thing. And she showed me terrors that, even after all of these years, I still struggle to put into words. I won't tell you all of the things I saw. Some things cannot and should not be seen. She showed me the bodies of my loved ones. Such visceral images, almost tangible. And I still remember Maria's face. Tears of blood trickled from her gouged eyes, staining her pale cheeks. The woman tortured me with these visions for hours. When I woke, I was tucked under a blanket in my car. I panicked for a second, believing I'd shirked my duty, but then I saw Matthew's car beside mine. He was sitting on the bonnet. I emerged from my vehicle on unsteady legs and checked my watch. It was sometime after 7 in the morning. The dawning sun cast a fantastic glow over a forest which suddenly seemed so calm and soothing. A different realm than the one of the night before. "I found you in the grass," Matthew said. "Thought you'd be more comfortable in the car." I nodded, not willing to thank the man who'd sentenced me to that hellish life. "It doesn't have to be this way," I said. "There has to be something that could end all of this." Matthew paused for a long time before saying something utterly unexpected. "You're not the only ranger burdened with this task. This undead affliction is a disease. It's spreading. There are other villages and hamlets cursed by her." "What is she?" I asked. "Nobody knows," he replied. "Somebody does," I said. "I can't let Henry suffer this fate. I have to find a way to save him. No, I have to find a way to save all of us." "I won't be around to see that boy," the old man said. "I'm so tired. And after so many years, I'm starting to understand what Matthew meant." It was the 2018 winter gathering. A pre-Christmas celebration for the entire village. 150 people packed like sardines in a cozy hall. A night of music, performances, and talks from prominent figures in the village. An amalgamation of festivities. "Do you mind doing the thing, honey?" I asked Maria. My wife raised her eyebrows suggestively. "In the middle of the town hall?" I snorted. "Not that thing. The back thing." "All right," Maria laughed. "You're such an old man." "I'll be standing up there for ages," I said, shifting uncomfortably in my seat. "I don't want to get that annoying knot in the bottom of my spine." "You'll be up there 5 minutes tops," she laughed. 36 is painful, eh?" "You should know," I replied, grinning. I received a thump on the arm, understandably, make risky jokes and receive fitting results. But Maria chuckled and twisted my torso to the side, before lovingly massaging my shoulders. I locked eyes with the neighbors, Tommy and Maggie, who were sitting a couple of rows behind us. Mags rolled her eyes at me, and Tommy rubbed his chin thoughtfully before whispering something to his wife. She shook her head. "Oh, look," Tommy said, pointing as the mayor walked towards the stage. "It's Mrs. Avers." "Stop it," Maggie tooted, slapping her husband's wrist. "And now, Peter Tully will say a few words," Mayor Aileen Balfour announced. "Put your hands together for our trusty park ranger." I'm not a public speaker. But, given the year's events, the villagers were expecting some promising words about the future. Matthew Wright had, 1 month prior, passed away. And as much as I loathed the man for tying me to that wretched place, I understood why he had done it. He tried to make amends. He had protected my family over the years. He had even searched for answers that might save the village, after claiming to have given up on the world. He craved redemption in my eyes. Matthew Wright was a desperate man, and I may well have done the same in his shoes. Maria, Henry, and I were the only people beside his hospital bed. A couple of villagers stopped by, of course, but his family died long ago. He was the last in a long line of Wrights cursed by the highlands of the dead. "Who's gonna keep Dad in line, Uncle Matt?" Henry asked. The old man chortled before spiraling into a coughing fit. "That's karma," I told him, smiling. He smiled back. "It's a shame that we should finally see eye to eye on my deathbed," he croaked, chuckling. "There are, of course, a few things we should discuss before I pass." Maria awkwardly cleared her throat. Come on, Henry. Matthew beamed at my wife and son as they walked out of the door. A beautiful family, he said. I nodded. I'm lucky. No, Matthew replied. You were unlucky to meet me. Look at you. You're not a boy anymore. I stole your life from you. I should have. I shook my head. You warned me that there were things you couldn't tell me. Dangers in the forest. I heard you and I felt a knot of fear in my gut. I could have listened to that instinct, but I didn't. I was carrying my own trauma. I had something to prove. But you should know that I chose to start a life here. And I have a family. I'm luckier than most. The old man spluttered. You know, I had a wife once. You never told me that, I said. Matthew shrugged. Long before you arrived in this village, I had already lived a full life. Paisley and I were trying for a baby. What happened? I asked. They came at night, he whispered. Inhuman things from the old factory over the ridge. Nobody really knows what happened there. But we know those things used to be people. And they took her. They took Paisley. The old man cried, and I comfortingly placed a hand on his shoulder. I was a park ranger. I knew about the horrors of the highlands, of course, Matthew continued. It was a secret passed down from the rangers to their children. Each of us took up the mantle from our parents before us. There were more of us back then. It seems the village gets smaller and smaller with every passing year. And now you're the only ranger left. What comes after you? I don't know. But we mustn't let Henry take your place, Peter. We mustn't. I won't let him step foot in those woods, I said. But I'm starting to lose hope, Matthew. 4 years, we've tried to uncover the root of this evil. Your family has been here for generations, and even they didn't know what to do. It didn't always used to be so terrible in our village. There were good times before. Well before the heartbreak, the tragedy. As for the land beyond the forest, well, the highlands of the dead spread farther than our patch of hell, he said. I've told you this before. There will be someone out there who knows the truth. How the tables have turned, I replied. I remember when I was the one trying to convince you to hold on to your hope. Well, that was before there were people in my life that I could call Effie. Matthew started, trailing off before sentimentality got the better of his Scottish sturdiness. I'm thinking about what comes after you, Peter. I don't think you've accepted that you won't be here forever. I looked out of the horizontal glass pane between Matthew's room and the waiting area. I could see Maria and Henry talking enigmatically. My son was somehow 12 years old. Time had flitted by at a cruel rate. In my eyes, I was still that 22-year-old boy who moved to the village with dreams of a quiet country life. Keep searching for the answer, Peter. Remember what you're protecting, he said. But in the event that you should fail, you need to make sure that somebody takes the reins. No, I said firmly. I will be the last park ranger. Or, at least, the last one who does anything other than spotting forest fires and helping hikers. There we go, Matthew whispered, smiling. I was worried you'd lost that youthful spark for a moment. I don't want you to end up like me, son. I smiled, patting the man's shoulder again before standing up and heading towards the door. Before you go, he suddenly said, we're trapped in this village, but help can still come to us. And that was the last thing he ever said to me. After mulling over Matthew's parting words, I made an arrangement with Mayor Balfour. She, like many others in the village, was aware of what lay in the highlands. Not all who visit the village become tied to this place. Tourists come and go from time to time, and there are even villagers who have left without resistance. But it is impossible to say who the highlands will or will not spare. We don't take risks. Those of us who keep this secret, keep our loved ones here. I have spent 20 years convincing Maria to never leave this place. I'm, not a good speaker, I said, laughing into the microphone. but Aileen insisted I speak to you about a guest. Before I could continue, a chair abruptly squeaked against floorboards. Heads turned to face a mysterious outsider who strolled down the main aisle. "Hello," the man bellowed, chuckling heartily. "I'll take over, lad. I can see that you don't want to be standing up there." An Englishman in a room full of Scotsmen. Never ends well, does it? The room erupted into a chorus of laughter, and I awkwardly shuffled away from the microphone, content to be standing silently alongside Aileen. When the man arrived on the stage, he hopped up with ease. "Good evening, my fellow Highlanders," he roared. "My name is Kieran Green. I come from a little hamlet just over the hills. I might know the one. Or maybe Whiteout because, well, Whiteout really leave this place, do you?" I anxiously eyed Aileen, and she nodded her head. We had not come to the decision easily, but it was time to do things differently from those who had come before us. I just dreaded how my wife and son would react to Kieran's announcement. The man sighed, planting his hands on the podium before him. "You see, there's something that many of you know. Something that you've not wanted to tell your loved ones. A secret of the land passed from generation to generation. And I know all about that. These highlands have been host to many a sorry sight. See, our hamlet used to be much bigger. And then they came. Dark things in the night. They killed our family and friends. And we swore it would never happen again. We realized that secrets would kill us all." A hushed wave of whispers spread through the hall, and I locked eyes with Maria. "What's happening?" she mouthed at me. I had no response. "There is a special duty performed by the park rangers of this village. Well, the sole remaining ranger. And it doesn't involve spotting fires or herding sheep. It's... Some things are better left unsaid." Tommy suddenly shouted, rising to his feet. "Stop making a scene, Tommy," Maggie begged. "I'm protecting you, dear," he said before looking at the crowd. "Yes, there are things that happen in those woods, but the people of this village don't need to know about them." "Wrong," Kieran shouted, silencing my neighbor. "Some of you have seen things you couldn't explain. Perhaps you have dismissed those things. But judging by the look on your faces, I'd say not. You are not safe. I ask again, how many of you have left this place?" The room fell silent. Kieran nodded. "And how many of you stay because at some point in your youth someone warned you not to leave?" I saw faces twist and turn, families eyed one another suspiciously. Eileen's husband cast a disparaging glare in her direction. Maria surveyed me with teary eyes. "I do not blame your village for spending a century concealing this treacherous truth," he said. "But we have watched tragedy after tragedy befall our land, have we not? And with each fresh horror, the darkness grows." "Why now?" a woman cried from the crowd. "Why tell us after all of these years?" Kieran turned to face me. "Ask the park ranger." I eyed the vicious mob sitting in the hall. Maria couldn't even look at me. Henry maintained his composure, but the color had drained from the little boy's face. "I made a decision," I said. "A decision backed by Matthew Wright himself. Don't bring his name into this." A man snarled. "You're not one of us." "Yes, we are." Henry screamed, attempting to stand. Maria held him down. "Matthew and I have seen things that most of you would never understand," I continued, striving to hide my unsteady disposition. "And we decided to break the cycle." "Please, Mark," Tommy said with tearful eyes. "Enough. You said your piece. It's done now." I shook my head. "It isn't done. And it'll never be done. Do you want to know what lies in that forest? The dead are dead. And we will continue to feed these highlands for as long as we do nothing. Look at our children. Do they deserve this?" "There is nothing that can be done," an old woman called. "All who tried have died." "Not true," Kieran interrupted, pushing me aside and leaning towards the microphone. "I have tried. Peter has tried. And we're still here. We know about the woods, the highlands of the dead, but we keep to ourselves and nothing bad happens. A man shouted. Oh, sir. Bad things happen all of the time, Kieran said coldly. Peter Tully has been giving his soul to the woods for 14 years. He's a shell of a man. Look at him. He does it for you. And if he were to stop, well, the forest would have to look elsewhere to feast on souls. Something has cursed this land, I interjected. We don't know what lies at the heart of the highlands. It wears many faces and takes many forms. All we know is that it never stops, Kieran finished. Mark, I understand that you want to protect us, Tommy said. But my mother told me things that, look, it's just, we can't fight it. Natural or unnatural, the might of the highlands will always best us. I'm not going to let this place take my boy, I whispered, eyeing Henry. Maria lifted her eyes to meet mine. They were brimming with tears, but she met my gaze. That was something. Kieran patted my back and took over. I visited one of the lake towns recently. Saw an old friend of my grandfather. He told me a story about a witch. Oh, come on. A man sighed. Listen, boy, Kieran spat. I don't want to test me. I'll drag you down to the forest myself and show you the... Kieran Green paused, collecting himself. All that matters is there might be a way to lift this curse, to free you from the death hanging over this place. Peter Tully and I will go to the woods tonight, and we will end this. But if we don't, well, at least you know the truth, and somebody brave can take up the mantle. It never should have been Peter's cross to carry. Matthew Wright forced him here, and... Let's not speak ill of the dead, I said, sensing the hollow atmosphere in the hall. Before I go. Where are you going? Maria cried in floods of tears. We'll talk later, I said. Look after Henry. All will be well, Kieran promised, ushering me towards him. We will gather here in the morning. The crowd talked restlessly, and Aileen rushed to the microphone as Kieran and I slipped out of a back door. I saw Henry standing and watching me with a lost expression. That went about as well as expected, Kieran said, unlocking his vehicle. I sighed, climbing into the passenger seat. Just go. As we tore off the tarmac, a few villagers poured out of the front doors and watched us drive away. They were never going to accept it, Kieran said. They've always known, deep down, but they didn't want to know. Would you have done what I did? I asked. I already have, the man sighed. I had a smaller crowd to appease mine. They deserved to know a long time ago, I said. Well, ignorance is bliss, Kieran replied. But we don't have that luxury in the highlands. I learnt that the hard way. He took a dirt road into the thick of the woods. I frowned. I usually turn a little farther up the main. We all learn hard lessons, Kieran said, interrupting me. My hamlet used to be a village, roughly the size of yours. But that all changed when the creatures came. Matthew told you all about that, didn't he? Yes, the incident at the factory, I said, frowning. But this road is the... And it wouldn't have happened if everybody had known, Kieran interrupted a second time. Since then, every time the creatures come, and they always come, my neighbors know what to do. Of course, they don't know what I do to keep them safe. There are still some secrets we must carry to the grave. Isn't that right, Park Ranger? He slowed to a stop and secured the handbrake. We were sitting in the middle of the forest. What are you trying to say, Kieran? I asked, unsettled by his shifting demeanor. The man sighed. I wasn't going to come here without a plan, Park Ranger. And do you know what I found when I did a little background research on you? A terrible story from London. A newspaper article about a police officer who fumbled negotiations with a robber. Do you ever dream of that little girl, Peter? The one who died as the result of your miscalculation. I clenched my fist. It wasn't like that. I didn't know he would shoot. But it's no secret. The whole city knew. That's why we moved to a place in which nobody knew your name? Kieran asked. Why are you doing this? I asked. Do you not trust me? Is that the problem? I want the same thing that you want. I know you do, Peter, he said. And aren't the Highlanders lucky to have such a brave Englishman on their side? He's come to save the day. We Scottish peasants would be lost without you. I don't really care about your ancient prejudice, I said, sighing. Let's just finish this. And the sudden blow to my temple sent a ripple of pain through my body. Acting on impulse rather than any conscious form of thought, I scrambled for the car's door handle and fell onto the forest floor. Prejudice? It's not as personal as that, Kieran said, stepping out of the driver's side. I hate the English, don't get me wrong, but this isn't some meaningless act. No, this is about the survival of my people. I groaned, clutching the side of my head and stumbling shakily to my feet. The vision in my right eye was uneven and blurry. My left eye was just as useless as ever. But I could vaguely distinguish Kieran approaching with a torch in his hand, the blunt instrument he had used to assault me. I don't know how to stop any of this, Kieran admitted, but I do know how to give the woods what it wants, and it's been craving you for a long time. I think it might finally spare my hamlet. All I have to do is give you to it. So I didn't lie, Peter. Not really. This is for the greater good. I stumbled to the side, supporting my weight on the car. What about this village? I asked. They're people of the Highlands too. Kieran shrugged, striding towards me. Not my people. Concussed and near blind, I raised an arm to defend myself. But Kieran swiftly bludgeoned my face a second time, and I fell to the ground in agony. Spitting teeth and blood into the dirt, I tried to crawl away. Family, Peter, he said. You understand, don't you? That's what it's all about. I told you. I don't care about Scotland or England. I just care about my own flesh and blood. I got 2 boys at home. So try to understand that. I rolled onto my back, propping my body against a nearby tree. The wind picked up and I heard strange guttural noises from the earth below us. It's almost time, Kieran said, raising his torch one last time. The forest will be so thankful that I brought you. You have saved people, Peter. Just not your people. Barely clinging to consciousness, I spat blood at his feet and the man laughed. I'll give you that one, Englishman, he said, patting the red specks on his trouser legs. And don't worry, I'll make this quick. I promise. I'm a man of my word. I croakily laughed. You're no man. Kieran scowled, raising his torch to finish the job. I closed my eyes and awaited the embrace of darkness. I could only see Maria and Henry. I prayed that they would find a way to free themselves of the Highlands. I didn't want their forgiveness, just their safety. A thud sounded, but I didn't feel a thing. And when I opened my eyes, I found myself facing an unlikely sight. Tommy Buchanan. He was towering over Kieran's crumpled body, and there was a shovel in his hands, a shovel which he promptly dropped to the ground before rushing over to me. He's no man, and he's certainly no Scotsman. Come on, Peter. I'm parked a dozen yards down the dirt track, he said, panting as he reached down and hoisted me to my feet. Let's get you to the hospital. I hobbled to the car, supporting my weakening body on Tommy's shoulders. Adrenaline kept me awake, but that was a good thing. I didn't want to pass out with a head injury. I closed the door and Tommy rushed to the driver's side. As his body flitted past the windscreen, I squinted, desperately trying to discern a moving shape at the edge of the treeline. Tiaran. Drive. I cried as Tommy clambered into the car. Kieran threw his body onto the bonnet. His bloody, bruised face matched my own. Watch out. I cried as Tommy rapidly reversed the car. The rear bumper collided with a sturdy tree trunk, and Kieran crumpled into the windscreen. "I'll kill you both," he said in a half-conscious grumble whilst weakly pounding the glass. As Tommy reached for the door handle, the wind began to wail shrilly. And then, in a flash of movement, Kieran's body was torn from the front of the car. Tommy and I watched in confusion as a shape rose from the dirt. A horrifyingly tall specter with the faint shape of a woman. But it was not human. I'd seen horrors like it before. The undead entity meshed seamlessly with the forest ground, and its branch-like arms seized Kieran by the throat. Something about her was different from the other creatures I'd seen in the highlands. The tattered clothes, so familiar. "Mercy," Tommy whispered. "It can't be." "What?" I asked, head falling apart at the seams. "Shirley Pond," he said. I recognized that name. I hadn't heard it since the day I moved to the village. 14 years earlier, Matthew had told me about a park ranger who disappeared in the woods. The one who came before me. My friend furiously revved the engine and beelined for the main road. We left Kieran and the undead spirit of Shirley Pond behind. Since that first night in the forest, I've always suspected that it might have been her whose gnarled, rotting hands saved me from the schoolteacher. I do not know for certain, but I know that she saved Tommy and me. Today the village faced its demons. 5 years have passed since Kieran Green took me to the forest. A lifetime in so many ways. The world has endured wars and a pandemic. But that reality seems so distant and detached from our village's bubble. Since that momentous winter gathering, the villagers have reconciled with one another. Maria and I work together now. I have promised to be a better partner. An arduous road led to that juncture. You see, it was never a question of whether I had told the truth in that town meeting. Nobody doubted the insidious nature of the highlands. Even those who had not ever walked the woods. We'd all seen things. We'd all felt things. No, this was about forgiving deceit more than overcoming disbelief. Following my brush with death, Tommy accompanied me on shifts, though Maggie didn't like him doing so. I wasn't keen on the old man doing it either. His arthritis was worsening, but he insisted that someone needed to look after me. He still views me as the boy he met 20 years ago. Speaking of which, Henry is 16 years old. An adult, apparently. Then again, I shouldn't tease him. Maria and I were only 6 years older than him when we moved to this place. A horrifying thought. This morning, as I sat in my watchtower and basked in the warm glow of the sunrise, a sudden knock jolted me from my chair. I spilled my cup of tea and sighed heavily before swiveling around to face the door. Outside the window there stood a man I didn't recognize. "May I enter?" he called. The man spoke with an English accent which left me leery. "Not until I know your name and why you're here," I said, reaching for Matthew's old revolver beneath my desk. "Not a legal firearm, of course, but my duties aren't exactly the same as those of normal rangers." "You don't know me," the man said, "but my name's Darren Grayson and I came across your story. I can help you." I'd heard that before. "May I enter?" he asked again. "Yes," I said, warily sliding the gun under my jacket. Darren opened the door and shuffled inside. He was around my age and he bore a similar tired, disheveled look. Scruffy facial hair. Crooked crow's feet. The man sat on the edge of my desk, a few feet from me, and I surveyed him curiously. "What are you doing here, Darren Grayson?" I asked. "I come from a hamlet over the ridge," he replied, pointing out of the watchtower window. "And it—" "Get out," I coldly interrupted, sliding the weapon from my coat. Darren's eyes widened and he quickly slid off the desk. "Come to avenge Kieran? Is that it?" I asked, narrowing my eyes and raising the revolver. "Kieran?" Darren asked. "How do you know that name?" "Your friend came here 5 years ago," I muttered. "He promised to save my village too." Darren raised his hands. "Listen, I don't know what happened, but Kieran was a very dangerous man. Please leave, I said. When you shared your story with the world, it found its way to me, Darren continued. I'm not going to tell you again, I hissed. He's dead, Peter, Darren said. Kieran's dead. I know, I replied. Shirley Pond killed him. What? Darren asked. No, he died a year ago. He tried to sacrifice me to the forest folk, but they claimed him. He made it back to the hamlet? I replied, eyes wide. Yes. Why does it matter? He's dead. I saw it happen, Darren replied. That's what I thought too, I said. Darren paused for a moment. I have good reason to believe that this time he died for good. That's why I'm here, Peter. The forest folk have perished. The old factory workers? I asked. Darren nodded. It happened in early spring. I sounded the alarm when they emerged from the forest, but they collapsed in the snow, one by one. We watched their bodies for days, waiting for signs of movement. They slowly started to rot. And then, with unnatural haste, the forest reclaimed them. It was like nothing I'd ever seen. What does this have to do with Kieran's death? I asked. Something came from the forest, Peter. A skeletal thing, Darren said. The woman? I whispered, shaking. Woman? He asked. No, it wasn't anything remotely resembling a man or a woman. It was a body constructed of entwined branches. It whispered to me, the rotten seed has been purged from this land. I paused. Kieran? Kieran, Darren agreed. No single thing poisoned our land. This infection has festered for a century or more, worsened by tragedy after tragedy. Perhaps since people first settled in the highlands. Perhaps it infects all places to some degree. And it spread by people, I finished. Darren nodded. People. Perhaps in our two hometowns, we have been misfortunate enough to experience one too many tragedies. The Greens had a long history of causing pain and suffering. It began long before Kieran. It was his great-grandfather who ran the factory, Lachlan Green. A tyrant who employed young boys and girls for a pittance. He forced them to work in terrible conditions. No sunlight. Scarce food. Many of the children developed rickets. And when they died a young, unnatural death, the forest claimed them. They joined the legions of undead, and they were sentenced to an afterlife in the highlands. Most likely, they came to our hamlet seeking revenge for Lachlan Green's injustice. They only ever wanted his great-grandson, I said. Darren nodded. Yes. And after they were finally laid to rest, I could have left the highlands with my family. But our hamlet has become a quiet, beautiful place. It was only when you shared your tale of horror that I realized this disease spreads beyond the ridge. So, you think something rotten lives in this village? I asked. The man nodded. There was the schoolteacher who killed those children. I started. Arnold Haversham? Darren asked. He's dead. He died nearly 30 years ago. I stalled, rubbing my chin thoughtfully. Like you said, it's never one thing that poisons a land. It's generational trauma. Darren nodded. Arnold mustn't have been the only evil at work. But I know these people. They're neighbors and friends. I don't want to imagine a wolf living among us, I said. Well, Kieran was a beloved leader, Darren explained. Dark things always hide in plain sight. The things I see in these woods are so often tied to that school, I said. Nearly every night, I see that building amidst the trees. Somebody in this town knows something, Darren said. I recalled a detail that had played on my mind for years. A joke Tommy made during that town meeting in 2018. Before Maggie interrupted him, he was on the verge of calling the mayor, Mrs. Aversham. I was certain of it. Come on, I said. We're going to see a friend. Oh, Darren replied, climbing to his feet. I think he might know something about the people Arnold left behind, I explained. We drove back to the village, and I anxiously twiddled my thumbs as we pulled onto Tommy's driveway. I didn't want to apprehend the man, but time was slipping through our fingers. Too many decades had been spent under the gnarled, decaying thumbnail of whatever lived beneath the highlands. I don't know why I said that about Aileen, Tommy nervously stuttered. It was a stupid joke to make. What was the joke? I asked. The man sighed exasperatedly. Who's your friend? Darren Grayson, my companion replied, outstretching his hand. Oh great, Tommy laughed. It's a blooming invasion of English folk. Tommy, tell me what you know, I said. Nothing, Peter. It was just a joke. He insisted. Mrs. Aversham. Was she married to Arnold Aversham? I asked. Tommy laughed, and then he immediately stopped himself upon seeing my face. Why's that so funny? I asked. The man paused for a second before sighing. It took me back to my days on the force. Investigating crime. Tommy was a lovely man, but he didn't perform well under pressure. My persistence finally wore him down. I've still got it, I thought to myself. Aileen was Arnold's sister, he muttered. She changed her name after everything. We all loved her, we never blamed her. We made her the mayor, for crying out loud. Is she his only surviving family? I inquired. What's the use in dredging up the past, Peter? Tommy asked. There might be a way to end all of this, I said. The man eyed me uncertainly. I sighed. 30 years have passed since Arnold Aversham took those lives, but the evil in the forest lingers, and it won't extinguish until we stamp out every last weed. Weed? Tommy asked. What are you saying? He's saying that evil lives here, Darren said. Right in the heart of your village. Tommy scoffed. You believe this, do you, Peter? One of our friends. Perhaps someone in one of our families? That school has haunted the forest for decades, I said. It calls to me. There has to be a reason for that. There has to be something we've missed. Arnold Haversham is dead, Tommy said. What more is there to say? A terrible thing happened, and the forest hasn't forgotten that. Trauma stains the highlands of the dead. That's how you've always explained it, Peter. Well, what do I know? What do any of us know? I replied. But if Darren's story about lifting the curse happens to be true. It is true, Darren promised. Well, I said. I think we should go and talk to the mayor. Tommy sighed. It's not Aileen who can help you. Then who can help us? I asked. The man cleared his throat. Her mother, Geraldine Aversham. She's still alive? I asked incredulously. He nodded. She keeps to herself. Old Victorian build by the lake at the forest edge. You know the one. The rundown shack off the A road? I said. It always looked abandoned to me. Haunted. Might as well be. Nobody but Aileen has seen Geraldine since Arnold did those terrible things. She doesn't speak. Doesn't even eat without assistance. There's nothing but a ghost in her place, Tommy said. It's a sad thing. She was the heart and soul of the village for many years. We all miss her. But Aileen says her mother just won't face the world. So, she probably wouldn't talk to us? Darren asked. Tommy shook his head. We have to try, I said. With Tommy anxiously watching from the driveway, Darren and I hopped into the car, and we drove to the lake. Before today, I hardly noticed the Victorian heritage of the ramshackle abode. There was nothing grand or glamorous about the neglected home. It was little more than a forgotten farmhouse, an eyesore that I'd never inspected during my 20 years in the Highlands. A feeble structure held together by flimsy foundations, much like everything and everyone in the village. That's Eileen's car, I said as Darren parked alongside a gray Range Rover. Might be for the best that she's here, Darren said, removing the key from the ignition. You know Aileen. She might be able to help Geraldine talk. Yeah, I said. As we exited the vehicle, nerves constricted my gut. I eyed the ancient house with mistrust, gingerly treading on cracked, grass-ridden stonework. We stepped onto the wooden porch before Geraldine's door, and it was not just the rickety, unreliable floorboards that filled me with unease. It was the atmosphere of our mid-afternoon house call. The lake was unnervingly still, but the woods swayed unstably, beckoning us to enter. I couldn't imagine living at the foot of the frightful forest by choice. Darren knocked on Geraldine's door and we waited for several minutes. Maybe we should. When Aileen answered, she was flustered and horrified to see us. Peter? What are you? Who's this? She asked. Darren Grayson, I answered. He comes from the hamlet beyond the ridge. And he's got a lot of nerve, Aileen interjected, eyeing Darren coldly. Kieran Green tried to condemn the people of this village too. I know, Darren said. I know that Mayor Balfour. But he's gone now, and we can fix everything. Our hamlet is free of the dead. My phone buzzed and I pulled it out of my pocket whilst the pair continued talking. It was Maria. I thought, I forgot to take Henry to school. I hurriedly texted my wife to apologize, and I explained that I was at Geraldine Aversham's house. She replied to say that Henry was already having a bad day. He was worried about the future. University. Something he would never get to experience if he were truly trapped in the village forever. Everything okay, Peter? Darren asked. Yeah, it's just... It can wait, I said, putting my phone back in my pocket. Did you explain everything? It's not happening, Peter, Aileen insisted. My mother won't talk to you. She doesn't talk to anyone. If we could just see her, I started. I said no. Aileen shouted, slamming the door in our faces. Well, that was odd, Darren said, sighing. Another dead end. I didn't spend many years as a police officer before moving to the Highlands. I would hardly call myself a world-renowned detective, and yet it was undeniable. Aileen is hiding something, I said. Darren frowned. Is she not just being protective? Her family has endured a lot. No, I replied, shaking my head. Her demeanor was off, and I'm thinking about what Tommy said. Geraldine was a beloved member of the community, and she's lived as a social recluse for nearly 30 years? No friends or family to visit her. Grief is a wretched thing, Darren said, sighing. I don't deny that, I said. I think Tommy and the other villagers buy that tale, but... You don't trust Aileen, Darren said. No, I replied. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized I'd never really trusted her. There had always been something evasive about the woman. She was a person of few words, a select few words. As Darren and I stood on the porch, contemplating our next move, a creak sounded from the rear of the house. The sound of a door opening. Reckon that's her? Darren asked. Only one way to know for sure, I said, motioning for the neighborhood watchman to follow me. As we crept around the side of the derelict house, I noticed a large window coated in assorted forms of overgrowth. I'm not sure what possessed me, but it was more than piqued curiosity. I found myself tearing the vines and shrubbery away, and then I began to scrub the window's filth with the sleeve of my jacket. Darren, I whispered, you might want to see this. Through a cleaned loophole I had formed in the center of the glass pane, we could see Geraldine's living room. It was illuminated by the midday sunlight, and on a dusty, neglected armchair, there sat a pile of ashy clothes with the vague posture of a sitting person. Is that... Darren started, quivering. Geraldine Aversham, I said. Darren and I did not say any more than that. We raced into the forest, keenly pursuing Aileen. She fled at a quickened pace, but her footprints betrayed her. And when we reached a sprawling clearing in the woods, I knew we'd found her secret. What is that? Darren asked breathlessly. The entrance to hell, I said. The ground had parted to reveal horrors in the hollow beneath, just as it did 20 years ago. And buried amongst mounds of soil and rocks, the twisted version of the village school stared back at us. It did not rise proudly above the treeline as it once had. It was a sunken wreckage hiding in an inexplicable chasm. The building lay on its back with its front doors facing the sky. "Wait," Darren said as I jumped into the ditch. "What are you doing?" I carefully tiptoed across the building, gulping as the brickwork groaned beneath my feet. "She's in here," I said, pointing at muddy footprints across the wooden doors. "I know, but don't open those doors." "Are you crazy?" he asked. "Nothing is ever as it seems in this forest," I said, smiling and stamping. The doors swung open and I fell forwards. But I did not endlessly plummet through a downwards-facing corridor. Gravity shifted, and I tumbled to the tiled floor of the haunted, lightless school. When I turned to look at the doors behind me, motion sickness seized my body. There was something truly ghastly about seeing the trees and the sky at a right angle. It was made all the worse by Darren's sideways body sliding into view. The man sighed, climbing down the hole. He tumbled through the doorway and fell onto his face. "I feel a little sick," Darren muttered as we both stumbled to our feet. "Then don't look behind you," I said, nodding my head at the doors. As I started to walk down the corridor, I heard the man pivot to see what I meant. He swiftly retched on the floor. Consumed by the building's darkness, I fumbled in my coat pocket to find my torch. And when I lit up the hallway, I was 20 years younger. My mind returned to that very first night in the Highlands. Nothing more than a frightened boy in a haunted house. After so many years, the terror had still not abated. Some horrors lie beyond what our primal brains can conceive. We strolled cautiously through the school, following the trail of mud down a weaving maze of hallways. And then we came to that door. That horrible door. Classroom 11A. There was movement inside. I turned off the flashlight, and I motioned for Darren to crouch down. "They want to ruin everything, my darling." A voice sobbed from inside the room. Darren and I peeked over the bottom of the classroom window. Eileen was inside. But that wasn't what terrified us. She was talking to a looming ghoul. A corpse that I recognized. Arnold Aversham. The malformed monstrosity that had caused so much death and suffering. And as it leaned towards Eileen, its voice carried in an inaudible, unearthly tone. "I know, my love. I'll bring you more little ones. I promise," she cooed, stroking her undead brother's cheek. "But things have been difficult." That same icy, inhuman whisper sounded. "Yes, Arnold, the ranger. He's brought someone to the village and—" Another whisper sharply sliced into her sentence. "Oh," Eileen said. "I see." And then her eyes shot to the window. She and her haunted sibling looked at Darren and me with equally black, lifeless eyes. Before we could rise to our feet, Arnold's arms had elongated. The door was wrenched from its hinges, and our bodies were dragged into the classroom by the murderous schoolteacher's undead fingers. He held us down as the mayor walked over to our writhing bodies. The withered, gray-haired woman sighed before squatting to my eye level. "Do you love your family, Peter?" she asked. "Would you do anything for them?" "I've always loved my brother. Nobody else did. Not the father who left us. Not our insufferable goody-two-shoes mother. Even when Arnold became a schoolteacher, following in her footsteps, he still wasn't good enough. But we silenced her ceaseless chattering and nagging, didn't we, Arnold?" "You're unwell, Eileen," I croaked as Arnold's terrifying fingers constricted my breath. "That's what they all said to my sweet brother," she moaned, clenching her fists. Yes, he struggled to socialize. He didn't want to wear the mask that was thrust upon him. But he was different. He was pure. And those children. Ghostly, muffled wails sounded beyond the walls. They were spoiled brats, Aileen snarled. They should have been honored that Arnold chose them. They were the purest of the bunch, and he wanted to be with them forever. What purer love can there be? As for you, the woman walked over to Darren Grayson, the cleanser of the Highlands. Death follows in your wake, doesn't it, Mr. Grayson? But your story ends here. This is our land, she shrieked, clasping her hands around Darren's throat. And when I'm done with the two of you, I'll pay a visit to your little hamlet, Mr. Grayson. Perhaps you have some pretty young playthings for my beautiful brother. In a sudden blur of motion, Darren plunged a knife into Eileen's abdomen. I hadn't seen his arm wriggle free of its restraints. The deranged woman howled in excruciating pain, clutching her wounded torso and stumbling backwards. Her inhuman brother released us, and he rushed to his sister's aid, cradling her in his rotting arms. Darren and I quickly scrambled to our feet. Is it over? I asked, backing towards the door. If she dies, Darren replied, joining me. The forest needs to be freed from... The forest? Aileen spluttered, laughing. I've never understood this fascination with trees and earth. I am the Highlands. Before we could respond, a sinister spectacle unfolded. Arnold Aversham's deformed body enveloped Aileen. His rotten flesh merged with hers, and the pair formed a singular abomination of decay and evil. I recognized the outline of the monstrosity before me, the horror that had dropped my baby from the watchtower. Had my boy been intended as a prize for her brother? The 10-foot-tall entity lumbered towards us on twitching, near-fleshless legs. Its giant form was bent sideways as it could scarcely fit in the room, and it only kept growing. Darren and I ran. I'm out of ideas, Peter, the man cried as we sprinted down the corridor. Yep, I shouted in response. The creature was pursuing without pause for breath, and its nearing growls made it quite apparent that we were not going to escape. The hellhound was too fast. But as we neared the school's entryway, I became aware of the floor's dampness. Peter, Darren started. I know, I replied. Smells like petrol. And as we turned onto the final stretch of corridor facing the outer world, I saw something entirely unexpected. In the entrance of the school, silhouetted by the day's dying light, a man and a woman stood anxiously. I could only distinguish their outlines, but I knew who they were. Is that Tommy? Peter asked, panting. And Maria? I said. Hurry! Tommy yelled. Before I could respond, I was swept from my feet. My body somersaulted into the school lockers like a limp rag doll, and my revolver clattered to the floor. I looked up at the enormous annihilator, the monster that had tormented our village for 30 years. A monster, it seemed, of two halves, two monstrous siblings. It had to die. And as I lay in a thick trail of petrol, I started to piece together the plan that Tommy and Maria had made. When we were clear of the school, they planned to set the building ablaze. However, Darren didn't run towards the exit. He beelined for the revolver. Get out of here, I cried. The Aversham abomination clutched Darren by the neck and hoisted him into the air. I saw the fear in the man's eyes as the unholy monster began howling in his face. Not wasting a moment, I stumbled to my feet and scooped up the firearm before aiming at the creature's arm. I prayed I would not miss. Prayed I would not hit Darren by mistake. After removing the safety, I fired. The Aversham creature screeched in agony, and its fingers reflexively released Darren's neck. Come on, I shouted, pulling the man to his feet. We scurried towards the exit, and I could see Maria fiddling with something. Our trusty lighter from home. Not so trusty these days, I remembered. I watched both Tommy and my wife fiddle with the device, while sweat dripped down their faces. When Darren and I reached the entrance, we turned to face the Avershams. The seemingly unwounded monster hurtled towards us. Peter? Tommy cried. The darkened, unnaturally long limb had silently spiraled around the corridor, merging with the forest's overgrowth. I hadn't seen it slither towards me, but I felt it yank my body to the ground. My revolver flew from my hand, and the beast began to pull me into its domain. "Peter!" Maria screamed, bending to pick up my dropped weapon. "Let him go!" A gunshot rang out, tearing into the creature's deteriorating flesh. I used the split-second distraction to stamp on the monster's arm, and it loosened its undead fingers, freeing me from its grip. I shuffled backwards, joining the others at the entrance. Maria fired again. The second bullet didn't connect with the monster, but she wasn't aiming for it. The petrol trail burst into flames, and the fire spread at such speed that the Avershams were already engulfed before they could screech in terror. We carefully backed out of the school, tumbling to the safety blanket of the forest floor. And I breathed a sigh of relief to find myself facing the right way up. Gravity had been restored. The four of us watched the inferno consume the school. Wallpaper withered, ceilings collapsed, and the shrieking abomination fell to its knees. A raging fire burnt that unhallowed place to charred ruins. We waited. None of us believed it to be over until the monstrosity had turned to ash. And then, when nothing of the Aversham abomination remained, the ground began to quake. The four of us stepped back, allowing the forest to reseal above the spectral school. Dirt piled into the cavity, grass rebuilt itself, and the air warmed. The highlands fell quiet as if nothing had ever happened. "Look," Darren whispered, pointing at movement in the trees. A branch-like entity emerged. It was followed by a blinding ray of sunlight, like a heavenly being. The phantom matched the description of the phenomena that Darren had described. The being that came after the cleansing of his hamlet. With trepidation, we watched the woodland creature slink into the empty clearing. It eyed us with what I presumed to be its face, and then it ceremoniously planted its roots into the soil. Slowly but surely the creature transformed into a large pine tree. It sprouted luscious green leaves and bloomed vibrantly. The proud pine rose a foot taller than the surrounding trees, and its colorful leaves distinguished it from the rest of the barren, wintry forest. The freshly grown tree lightened the air. A hard thing to explain, but it did just that. The weightiness of the forest lifted. "I feel freer," Tommy said. "Thank you," I whispered to my wife, embracing her. "It's over. We can live again," she tearfully said. "I pray that this marks a new chapter for our village. These will always be the highlands of the dead, but the dead can finally rest." When I was in my 20s, I took a job as a park ranger at a state park. It was the perfect job for me at the time. I love working outdoors. Every day presented new challenges, and I got to work alone. On days when I could get my work done early, I would find a beautiful spot somewhere in the park and read or listen to music. It was therapeutic. I had just gone through a tough year, school kicked my ass, and I had just broken up with my long-term girlfriend. I needed an escape, and the park provided it. While working during the day was amazing, the night shift at the park wasn't as relaxing. Do you know how uncomfortable the night can make even the most comfortable spaces in your house feel? Well, the pitch black of Mother Nature is like that feeling on steroids. The absolute worst place to sit during a night shift was the North End Watchtower. Everyone who worked there called it the Sentinel because it was massive and looked out across the whole of the forest that made up the park. It was tall, just over 100 feet above the ground, and made of old pine that seemed to retain the scent as if it had just been cut the day before. It was basically like a little cabin on top of really tall stilts. However, inside wasn't exactly like a luxury box. The wall that faced the forest was one large window that gave pretty breathtaking views but was also really good at giving you feelings of vertigo. Inside there was relatively meager furniture. There were just 2 chairs, one for sitting in good weather and one insulated one for bad weather, an old desk, a single bare light bulb overhead, and a small fan to help keep you cool. I always brought something to read or write because the night watch in the tower is dull as hell. It was quite a hike, too. It took about 10 minutes or so to walk the 10 stories. When you had to do it in the dark at night, it tended to take a little longer. Each story you climbed disappeared into the darkness below you. Could be a bit unsettling. Once you're on top of the tower, your job for that shift is to basically look for fires or anything else out of the ordinary. When there was a full moon, you could see so much of the woods. But when there was a new moon or cloudy, you couldn't see a goddamn thing. If it wasn't for the bare light bulb in the cabin, you couldn't see anything. Typically, you keep in touch with people on the walkie and just idle away the hours. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I never dozed off for a while, but if you had come to visit me some nights, I might have had sleep creases on my face. Most nights, when I was in the Sentinel, I brought a book and read or a journal to write in. Basically, occupy my mind for the shift and ignore the dark. Rangers, especially older ones, love to tell stories about the weird shit they've seen over the years. People tend to think of parks as safe zones where the most deadly thing that can happen is an animal attack. And yes, while animal attacks do occur, most of the violence comes from people. Campers, drunk, will get into fights or fall into fire pits or get lost on their way to the bathroom. Drifters will sneak into the park and stay in unoccupied cabins or buildings. I cannot tell you the number of times I've walked into squatters chilling in a distant ranger cabin and have had to evict them. But one thing no one outside the world of park rangers likes to talk about is that parks, especially at night, tend to be a haven for criminals. I know it sounds crazy at the outset, but it happens. Murders, rapes, drug activity, you name it, it happens. I was lucky to never deal with any of the more heavy stuff. A few times we found drugs to be sold or a small patch of marijuana growing in the woods, but nothing horrifying. But if you've put your time in at a park, eventually, you'll run across something that will haunt your dreams. Not too far from where our park was, there was a correctional facility. It wasn't Alcatraz or anything that high security, but the people there were serious criminals. It was a distance away. On clear nights, you could barely make out the lights from the yard along the horizon, but it loomed large in your imagination. Your rational brain knew that any criminal could have to brave the dangerous forest in pitch black before they ran into you, but a tiny flicker of light kept a corner of your brain illuminated. It could happen. It won't, but it could. It was near the end of summer, and some of the staff had already split for the year. I was on for a few more weeks, but I was going to get night duty for most of those days since I was lowest on the totem pole. Worse, I would be on sentinel duty those nights. I know having the least amount of seniority was the main reason, but I know that my boss and a few older rangers play poker those nights as well. Since I had no money or skills, I was sent up into the tower. As the sun was starting to set, I walked into the central station at the park entrance. A few rangers were milling about, shooting the shit. The day shift was relaying night shift things they should be aware of, that kind of stuff. It mainly was nothing. Not a ton of campers in the park this time of year, just a few sightings of bears nearby. Someone also swears they saw a bobcat but wasn't sure. But then someone walked into the station and the tenor of the night shifted. "Excuse me," a woman about 40 said in an overly polite way. She was dressed in leggings, and my guess was she was here to walk the trails. My boss, and wannabe Casanova, Jonesy, noticed the outfit and lack of a wedding ring and shot her his 10-cent smile. "Welcome to a State Park. How can I help you today?" he said, his words dripping with saccharine. Hi," she said, a little taken aback. "I wanted to report something. Well, maybe report is a bit extreme, but just make you aware of something I saw out on the trails." "Sure. What did you see?" She shifted her weight, a little uneasy it seemed. I clocked it and thought it was a little unusual. Sometimes when people see a bear or a bobcat, two things that had been spotted recently, They might have their adrenaline pumping and be a bit jittery, but this wasn't that. It sounds crazy, but, I think I saw something stalking me out in the woods. I'm sorry to hear that. Probably gave you a bit of a spook, Jonesy said. We've had a few bear and bobcat sightings lately. No, she said definitively. It wasn't a bear or a cat. I think it was a person. What trail? Sandalwood Loop B, I think it's called. That's not that far from a few campgrounds and fishing cabins. They didn't look like a camper. Everyone in the cabin had stopped talking and turned their attention to the woman. She noticed, and you could see the red rush to her cheeks. What did they look like? They looked shadowy, she said, like they were afraid of the sun or something. And they were following you? I caught something in the corner of my eye around the last turn of the loop. I stopped and pretended to stretch, and I saw something in the woods just off the trail. They were hiding behind a tree, eyeballing me. Jesus, Jonesy said, I'm sorry that happened to you. Thank you, she said, her voice going soft. They followed me until I nearly got to the end of the loop. I started running then and lost sight of them. Jonesy turned back to two of the older rangers and told them to hop in a gator cart and check out the woods for anything. He told them to keep their walkies on and take a sidearm just in case. They left in a flash, and Jonesy turned his attention to the woman. Can you tell me anything that might help? Did they have any kind of identifiable clothes? Did they speak to you? They, she interrupted, they made noises. Noises? Jonesy asked, slightly confused. Yes, a few. They made a kind of a chittering noise. An faint, yelling kind of sound. Possibly cicadas, another older ranger said. A group of them can scare the fur off a cat. Maybe, I dunno. They also whistled, but not like they were whistling at me. It's like they were trying to blend in with nature. Can you describe the noise? She whistled something that I knew right away. That sounds like a wood thrush. How do you know that? Jonesy said, not being able to help himself. My grandpa was an avid birder. He turned his attention back to the woman. Did you want to file a police report or? No, she said quickly. I don't even have that much information. I just was scared and wanted to let you know just in case. Are you sure? Yes, she said. I don't think anyone else was on the trail after me, but I didn't feel right not telling you. I'm so sorry that happened to you here. The park is supposed to be a place to relax. She laughed nervously. Jonesy shot her a calming smile. Here's my card, he said, handing her one. If you change your mind, please call me. She pocketed it and nodded. She turned to leave and then stopped. She turned back and, after a brief pause, said, Something else that was weird, I saw this thing on both sides of the trail. He crossed behind you? I didn't notice him doing that, but he must have because I saw him on both sides. Unless there was more than one of them, I said, instantly regretting it. Jonesy turned and gave me a Jesus dude look and I clammed up. Do you need someone to escort you to your car, ma'am? No, I'm right out there. Thanks though, she said as she walked out the door. We heard her motor away a few moments later. Sorry, I said before Jonesy could say anything. He sighed. No worries. Just don't go freaking out, guess. We need people like her to come back. People like her to come back, right? Was I too obvious? Jonesy said with a smile. What do you think she saw? I asked. A Wendigo, one of the other rangers said, and everyone laughed. Having read about Wendigos and skinwalkers in a mythology class, I didn't find it so amusing. Might have been her eyes playing tricks on her. If someone is out there, those two will find them. They're good at tracking, and whatever is out there couldn't have gotten too far. Great night to be up in the tower, I said with a smirk. That's probably the safest place to be, Jonesy said. No one climbs 10 stories if they don't have to. I hung around for about another half hour or so to see what came of the trackers. They came back and said there wasn't anything around the sandalwood loop. No footprints of anything they saw. Granted, the leaves had started to fall, so it was hard to see anything on the ground, but I trusted their tracking skills. Not going to lie, even with the guys coming back empty-handed, I was still a bit nervous about the shift. Jonesy was right though, no one climbs stairs unless they have to. This is still America. After all, laziness always wins. Also, there was nothing in the cabin above the trees except me, a book, and a journal. Nothing worth making the journey. As the sun slid behind the horizon, I started my trek to the Sentinel. When I got to the platform at the bottom, something caught my eye. The tower base is lousy with stickers, tags, and names carved into the pine. Usually it's Joe plus Jane for Eva, or something along those lines, but what had been freshly cut was a bit different. It was a pair of eyes. Had the earlier events not happened, I probably wouldn't have even noticed the eyes. I chalked it up to my mind already being primed to see some spooky shit. I assumed it had been some kids earlier or one of the older rangers looking to give me a scare. Whatever it was, I did a quick glance around me before I started up the stairs. From the vantage point high above the trees, you can see storms come rolling in. Tonight was no exception. It was a waning crescent moon tonight, so it would be a bit dark, but those rain clouds made it pitch black. The only natural light I would see would be the occasional burst of lightning inside the clouds. The wind had picked up too. You can tell because there is a slight shift in the tower when the winds gust. Not a lot, but just enough to notice. You get used to it, but when it first hits, it can be a bit jarring. There were a few wind gusts, but I settled in for the evening and stopped noticing. About an hour later, my walkie crackled to life. "How's the view?" It was Jonesy. "Great," I said. "We're about to do a pass around the park. Wanted to give you a heads up." I leaned forward in my chair and glanced through the window towards the base. I saw Jonesy and a few other rangers getting into their gator carts to head out. Their headlights were bright, but only because there was literally no other light down there. The beams themselves only saw a few feet in front of you. "Thanks. You guys need me to scout anything for you?" "No, we'll be fine. But hey, if you see any wendigos, let me know, huh?" "Funny," I said. "If you hear any thrushes singing, run. Those boys should all be in bed by now." "I'll keep that in mind. Be back in a half hour, 40 minutes tops." "Over and out," I said, and I placed down my walkie and watched those tiny ants drive off into the woods and out of sight. I kicked back in my chair and started reading again. That's when I heard a board creak. At first, my mind assumed it was probably just the wind pushing the tower. It can cause a creaking sound in the tower. But my brain pushed away the fog of rationality, and a more terrible thought became clear. What if someone was outside the door? I would have heard them walking up the stairs, right? I looked around for anything I could use as a weapon. Outside of smashing my walkie or flashlight into this potential person's head, there wasn't much. If I did need to escape, light and communication would probably be a good thing to have. Didn't want to go and break essential equipment. I grabbed my walkie and pressed the button. "Jonesy," I said, trying to sound confident. "Jonesy, you out there?" I knew there was a chance he might be out of range. Sometimes these walkies can be wonky in the forest, and I was praying he would respond. But the longer I heard the static, the less hope I had he could hear me. "Jonesy, just curious if you guys had circled back this way." Finally, "Yeah. Ned forgot his light and we came back, but we're heading out now." "Okay," I said. "Hey, odd question, but did anyone come up to the Sentinel by chance?" "Just you," he said, and then added, "Why?" Thought I heard a board creak. "It's breezy tonight, storm coming in, probably just the wind." "Or the Wendigo," he said, chuckling to himself. "Have fun," I said, ending the conversation. I put my walkie back down and stared at the door that leads to the stairs. The odds that someone would have walked up here to put a scare in me was remote. Like Jonesy said earlier, No one walks 10 stories unless they have to. But what if the woman from earlier had seen someone, or a group, and they were looking for a place to hide out? Would the sentinel be a good choice? Maybe. I don't know how the criminal mind works. Regardless, for my own sanity, I would have to swing that door open and see if anything was there. It was probably nothing, but I needed to be sure. If not, the rest of my shift was going to be miserable. I quietly walked across the cabin to the door and grabbed the handle. I counted down from 3 in my head and swung the door open. There was nothing there. In the distance, a flash of lightning crashed and thunder rolled, but no person was standing there. I sighed and then stepped out onto the landing. You could really feel the breeze up here now. That storm was moving in quickly. You could smell the rain coming. The earthy scent that the raindrops stir up was all around me. Even though I was sure no one was outside the cabin, I wanted to check out the stairs just in case. I walked over to the stairs and stared down. In the darkness, the stories below me just merged with the night. I couldn't see anything. I pulled out my flashlight and shone the beam down the stairs to the next landing. The flashlights we had were decent but not ideal. Cops got 1,000 lumen flashlights to shine in your eyes when they pull you over, and we were lucky to get half that. It's not like we'd need adequate lights working in the pitch black or anything. I walked down to the first landing and glanced around. Nothing seemed out of place. I flashed my light down to the next landing and something caught my eye. The light reflected off of something on the stairs. Not unlike a toddler, I made my way to the shiny object. I was a little surprised to find a small piece of reflective strip on the stairs. I didn't remember seeing it on the way up. I would have picked it up to throw it away. It looked like it had been ripped off of a jacket or uniform or something, but how did this get here? The wind might have blown this up from a campsite, but that felt wrong. It was. I turned to climb back up to the cabin when I froze. On the railing, someone had carved another set of eyes. I didn't move. I stood there as my brain tried to piece together an excuse that made sense, but it was failing. Even when I started to feel the patter of rain on my face, I didn't move. What the hell was going on? Fearing that someone might be looking at me, I clicked off my flashlight. I know I said earlier that I didn't want to waste essential tools, but at this point I was ready to brain someone until the damn thing broke. The rain started to come down a bit harder, which helped to break me from my fugue state. I was about to start back up towards the cabin when I heard the floorboards above me squeak. There was a crash of thunder nearby, and it barely registered in my mind. I was so tuned into the symphony of pine stairs that a bomb could have blown off near me and I'd miss it. After what felt like 17 hours, I hadn't heard anything else. I relaxed a little bit. It was probably nothing. My mind was overactive, and I was stringing together disparate events into a cohesive narrative to scare myself. I was sure that was it. Then I heard something drag across the pine above me. It sounded like someone was gouging out the wood. I didn't know what to do. My legs felt like jello. I wanted to go streaming down the stairs, but I was afraid I would make too much noise. Plus, the idea of running down 8 stories of now wet steps didn't sound ideal. I slowly started making my way towards the stairs heading down when the gouging noises above me stopped. After a slight pause, I heard footsteps head towards the door of the cabin. Someone was up there. I was sure of it. What they wanted to do? Well, I didn't want to think about that. I slowly started down the stairs, careful to not let any of them squeak underneath me. I kept my flashlight off and just descended into the darkness. I reached for where my walkie should be and cursed to myself when I realized I had left it up there. As if on cue, I heard the cabin door swing back open and heard an object crashing through the trees towards the ground. As it passed me, I heard the familiar static of the walkie. Whatever was in the cabin had just tossed my only lifeline to the outside world. Well, fuck. That wasn't good. I hastened my trip down the stairs. As I rounded the landing for the 6th story, I suddenly heard the familiar call of a wood thrush 3 landings below me. Only the thrushes were gone at this time of night. This was a person. He made the noise again, and it clicked as to why they would give their position up. He was signaling to the person above me. He was letting him know where I was. One above, one below. I was trapped. Above me, I heard someone start down the steps. They moved slow and steady, deliberate. Whoever was up there was coming down to me, and I had nowhere to go. I thought about jumping down and trying to grab a branch on the way, but knew that would end poorly for me in the best of scenarios and deadly in the worst. They rounded the second story down. I was running out of time for a plan. I could run down the stairs and try to bull rush whoever was down there, but the rain was coming down harder now and we could slip and fall off the tower. The only thing I had going for me was the darkness. I had the only light, and outside of the occasional lightning flash, it was dark as hell. It would cloak me if I could find a spot to hide. As he rounded the landing above me, I made a decision that, looking back, was one of the wildest things I've ever done in my life. I wake up some nights gasping for breath because I dreamed about doing this. The instinct to survive is so deeply ingrained into our animal brain that I suppressed all the fear I would usually have and just acted. As quietly as I could, I climbed over the handrail on the landing and hung off the side of the stairs. My feet felt for the handrail on the landing below me to help steady me, but my toes just grazed against the wood. I couldn't reach them. My arms started burning as they held my weight. I clawed into the wood with my hands, hoping my nails digging into the pine would counteract my wet palms. I closed my eyes, partially to shut out the pain in my arms and partly because I was afraid the whites of my eyes would get noticed. I heard the footsteps turn the corner and start to come down the stairs right next to me. I held my breath. My arms were burning and I was so afraid I would lose my grip. The person took the steps one at a time, slow as possible. They were looking for me on the landing but didn't see me. Suddenly, whatever it was started chittering into the darkness. A few seconds later, the wood thrush called back. The footsteps stopped coming down the stairs and started going back up. No. In a flash, a solution came to me. I used my right foot to kick off my left boot. Suddenly, I was glad I didn't take Jonas's advice to keep the laces as tight as a drum. I kicked my boot onto the landing below me and they landed with a heavy crash. The footsteps stopped going up the stairs. I freed my other boot and it crashed down next to their partner on the landing. It sounded like I was down there. The footsteps walked right past me, heading down quickly to surprise me on the landing below. As soon as they rounded the corner, I called upon all the strength in my body and quickly pulled myself back up over the railing. I landed with a thud which gave away the ghost. I popped up and dashed up the stairs to the top of the cabin. I knew they'd be right behind me, so I didn't hesitate. In seconds I was at the top of the stairs and outside the cabin door. I was met with another pair of eyes carved into the wood. They stared back at me, watching and waiting to see what I was going to do next. I dashed into the cabin and leaned against the door to brace against anyone trying to burst in. I knew two people, at least I hoped they were people, were coming, and they were going to not stop until they got into the cabin. Another bolt of lightning flashed nearby, and the ensuing thunder shook the tower. Things were close. I glanced up and noticed that someone had carved another set of eyes staring at me just above the window. Only this time they left a message with the picture. You watch us, but who's watching you? I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I swallowed hard as I heard two sets of footprints reach the top of the landing. Sure enough, they charged into the door, pushing it open slightly. I braced hard against the door and started yelling. Just the most primal screaming I've ever done. They kept thumping the door. Each thrust pushed the door open a bit more and a bit more. I was struggling to hold out against them. I was tired and my socks were slipping on the wood. It was only a matter of time until they burst through. I thought about my life. I thought about my parents, my friends, all the things I'd never get to do. Then the hair on my arms started to stand on end. then my leg hair. Then my hair started to rise. Only it wasn't fear that was causing this. It was something much more primal, much more natural, much more powerful. I dashed across the room and sat on the insulated stool, a beat-up wooden seat with glass legs, and held my feet up. As the door burst open, I saw two sets of eyes staring at me. The two faces grinned, and the cabin light reflected off the blade of a knife. I screamed as everything went white, and what sounded like the sky splitting in two erupted around us. Lightning had struck the tower. I was safe. Glass and wood are shitty conductors. But the two men who were standing in a puddle weren't as lucky. The blast had shocked them and sent them tumbling down the side of the tower. When I opened my eyes, I could see the burn marks across the pine and smell the fire that had been started. Without giving anything a second thought, I dashed out of the door, careful not to catch myself on fire, and ran down the stairs of the Sentinel. It may take 10 minutes to climb up, but it took me about 2 minutes to get down. As soon as I hit the bottom landing, I saw the lights of the gator carts pull up. I collapsed on the ground as Jonesy and the other rangers rushed over to me. I glanced up and saw his face, and I started to sob. Above him, the flames licked and ate away the tower floor by floor. It would burn for over an hour. I later learned that the two men killed by the lightning were escaped convicts from the jail. Both of them had beat up a guard, grabbed their clothes, and headed out into the woods 3 days earlier. The escape had been kept quiet because they didn't want to spook anyone and thought they'd track them down in the woods sooner rather than later. Why scare people if you didn't have to? Also, fuck that noise. They both had been convicted of murder, and I swear to God, this is what the police told me: the criminals had ill intent for me. I told the officers I had gathered that. Thinking back, they probably watched me climb up the tower later and saw an easy target. When I had first heard the floorboard squeak outside the door, the criminal that had followed me up made a quick decision to climb up onto the roof of the cabin to prevent me from seeing him until he was ready. I probably didn't hear anything on the roof because of the fan and the rain. I think about what he could have done to me had he caught me by surprise, jumping down from the roof, and shudder. At best, I'd be stabbed by a madman. At worst, I tumbled 10 stories to my death. Either way, not a great thing to linger on during idle hours. That was my last day as a ranger. I was due back to school in a few weeks, and I needed time to calm my nerves. Everyone understood. They even paid me out for the week, which was nice. I also took a small part of the Sentinel as a memento of the ordeal. Every time I look at the piece of wood I took from the tower, I wasn't reminded of what could have happened to me, but instead of what I did to survive. Someone was watching me that night, but it wasn't just the criminals. It was nature herself.